different, sorry, time for the yeah. That's cool. It's possible to sort of equations. It's the main plus one and like that something like we say like carpet.
Let's just stand.
Okay.
Just turn on the camera. So I can check this. Fernando, is it broadcasting to YouTube? Okay.
PowerPoint, whatever that means. There we go.
Think whatever you prefer, if you want to. If you want to. There are two options. One option is we release the and do not share screen or
No, Chef, I didn't think you
share screen is better, right?
Yeah, I mean, inside Zoom.
So just please share screen. And then Sandra is doing the afternoon introductions.
Good.
Are you sharing?
I am sharing.
Okay, great. Just one thing before we begin, let me just join please here because I'm controlling it from you. So perfectly. This is here.
Sure. You gave me the title, sir.
I know that you're going to join. Are you going to do anything? Because we need to give permission and then when we begin. Okay, Sandra, can you do the intros?
The intros.
Yeah, can you moderate them or should I?
Yeah, I don't have any. Okay, but I'll just do the timing.
Okay, that's it. So, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a good lunchtime. We're coming back now, with Sandra being responsible for timing, so no more delays from now on. Welcome back. We're going to listen now to Brian, Professor of Anthropology and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences of the Aga Khan University. He's going to be talking about incorporating ethnocultural diversity into national cohesion and conflict resolution policy. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you to Bruce and the OECD for bringing all this together. And of course, thank you to you. You've taken time out of your day to come listen to something which I think you may be disappointed there are no answers from me. I'm going to spell out, I hope, just a little bit of the scale of the problem in Pakistan, and then suggest something that might be a pathway to a solution. Then I'm going to hand it over to Bruce to let him elaborate a little bit more on just how that solution might be implemented. Pakistan, you've all heard of Pakistan, I'm sure. Pre 9/11, one of my big problems, whenever I said I worked in Pakistan, people would say, oh no, what do you think of those bastard Israelis? And I would say, I don't think anything of those Israelis because they're nowhere near me. No, Palestine, Pakistan, that's the same thing, right? So that doesn't happen anymore. Everyone knows now Pakistan's the den of one batch of terrorists and Palestine's the den of another batch of terrorists. But more importantly, Pakistan really is an important puzzle piece in this world peace. If we don't solve Pakistan, then forget about peace anywhere else, because this is 240 odd million people who are really quite desperate. And one of the issues is, of course, a lack of any kind of national unity. It's a very diverse place, which in many respects is wonderful. It may look quite homogenous on the surface because you've got 97% of the population is Muslim. But if you break that down, and so the 97% Muslim, roughly 2% Hindu, roughly 1% Christian, then roughly smatterings of non-Muslim, non-Christian, non-book religions. So you have the Kalasha, which is an animist religion in the mountains. You have a small number of Sikhs. You have a small number of just others. Up until the mid-70s, you even had a Jewish community in Karachi, but that is now completely gone. There are people who claim to have a crypto-Jewish community still living in Karachi. If I knew about it, I wouldn't tell anyone, but I don't know about it. But even if you look at that 97% Muslim and think, okay, well, they're all the Ummah, that's the Muslim community, it's still not very helpful, because within that, you've got roughly 90% of the Muslims are Sunni and 10% are Shia, which does, by the way, give us the second largest Shia population in the world. Even though it's only 10% of 240 million is a considerable population. But within the Sunni, you have a big division between the Barelvi, who are much more of a kind of a Sufi, emotionally related relationship to Islam, and the Deoband, which is more of the Pathan and the kind of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa areas. And those groups are they see Islam rather differently, so they don't identify with one another. And then you have within the Barelvis, you have different groups, you have the different sort of franchises from the different Sufi communities, and each one of them will have quite a strong corporate identification with their group, but not with the other groups. So, you know, divisions just keep on going. And of course, you also have the official provinces. There are 4 official provinces, each one that kind of maps onto a linguistic group. We can say the North, Gilgit-Baltistan, Hunza, this is disputed territory with India, and Kashmir, that too has a certain kind of ethno-linguistic logic to it. But if you look at any detail in any of these provinces, what you see is huge fragmentation. So I worked for the last 27 years, I've worked in the same villages in North Punjab, where they speak Punjabi, but Punjabi that we speak in that northern Punjabi village is very different from the Punjabi of Lahore, which is where I learned Punjabi. And it's very different from the languages of South Punjab, of Central Punjab. So Punjabi itself is a fragmented language. So across the board, no matter where we want to draw boundaries, if we look in any detail inside those boundaries, we find greater and greater fragmentation, greater and greater reason for division. This is a kind of ethno-linguistic map of Pakistan, and you see big areas that look like, okay, this could be some kind of unifying linguistic unity in that community. But you look inside there and it simply means nothing, right? Dig into any of these communities. In the Punjabi village that I've worked in, there are about 5 villages that speak their dialect of Punjabi. You go literally 10 kilometers away and you can't use the same phrases anymore. So linguistically, there are such micro-linguistic areas that it really isn't a force for unity. Urdu, the national language, interestingly, is not the native language of any of the indigenous groups in Pakistan. Urdu comes from another part of India, and it was brought into Pakistan as the kind of lingua franca for the country. The other option for that, by the way, and actually my boss's grandfather's solution to this was to make Arabic the national language. So to really make it a foreign language for everyone, which in his defense, the Aga Khan III thought this would be the unifying independent language. Everyone would learn this, and then you wouldn't have any one ethnic group being able to claim primacy in this new imagined community of Pakistan. So we know that the linguistic diversity is huge, the religious diversity is huge. It doesn't mean the state hasn't tried to unify people. And one of the many national mottos of Pakistan is faith, unity, and discipline, right? So Iman, Ittihad, and Nazam. And this comes right from the very beginning, from the founding father of Pakistan. He said, this is what we should be promoting. We all share a faith, right? Maybe different around the edges, but we all can unify around a faith. We all believe in a homeland for Muslims. We all believe in a place where Muslims can be safe. And then they tacked on this discipline, which sadly echoes a kind of reverence for the military, which lasted a while, but is definitely on the outs now. I think you can say uncontroversially that the population of Pakistan has fallen out of love with the army. And there is more open criticism of the army than there ever has been. So this faith, unity, discipline motto, which was always tagged onto something quasi-military, is now looking more and more thin as a unifying feature. But at the national level, these top-down approaches, they have tried to use the national curriculum. So in the primary schools, secondary schools, they tried to have a common curriculum for everyone, much like the United States. So I didn't go to school continuously in the US, but I went to probably 6 years out of my schooling. And every year I would go back from living outside the US, and it was the same history over and over and over. It was about 1492 up to about 1945. And 60% of it was the American Revolution, 30% of it was the American Civil War, and then smattering of Corn Tax Acts and Irish Acts and these things around the edges. But that was very clearly a nation-building exercise that works in the US because everyone goes to school in the US. There are 23 million school-aged children in Pakistan who will never set foot inside a school. So that's right off the bat, 10% of the total population that are not being subjected to any of this propagandizing nation-building exercise. So that's already a weakness. But then you go beyond that, much of that propaganda is really very crude. It's easily dispelled by people's lived memories, because Pakistan's a fairly young country, 76 years old. When they start talking about the dangers of India, well, many of the people who go to school have grandparents from India, so they will go home and they will have a different narrative about what India was. Many of the people in Karachi still has a very high Hindu population. So much of the national curriculum, for example, when they discuss the 1857 War for Independence stroke mutiny, that in the national curriculum, that is very much a battle between Hindus and Muslims. And the British are kind of there being either the puppets of the Hindus or the masters of the Hindus, depending on which angle you want to take. But it's a Muslim uprising against these Hindus and these British. But of course, that's at odds with some of the other histories, the other ways that we describe this particular moment in time. So one of the problems with the national curriculum is it erases some people and some events from history, and it elevates other people and events from history that may actually fall foul of people's lived memories. The memories of partition, for example, which might have served as some kind of national unifying element, has been so wrapped in an attempt to create a Pakistan that is at odds with India, that it's difficult to allow people to kind of unify around that trauma, because it's being hijacked to say, look, the Hindus are our enemy, the Hindus. Interestingly, if you read the contemporary accounts of that partition, much of the violence was committed by Sikhs. That's not part of the Pakistani narrative, so that goes out the window. It's all Hindus. So people will learn that the Hindus were the evil people in school. They go home, and the stories from their families, if they are lucky enough to have families that will share those stories, is actually more likely to be about Sikhs committing violence and their families committing violence against Sikhs. So in Punjab, that was a massive movement of people that was incredibly violent, and it doesn't match the national curriculum. At the university levels, there is less direct intrusion, but we do have two mandatory courses that everyone has to take in university. One is called Pakistan Studies, Ideology and Constitution. You must teach Pakistan's ideology. So I'm the Dean of a Faculty of Arts and Sciences, the liberal arts program. We teach Pakistan history, we teach South Asian history, and I am responsible for making sure that my students learn Pakistan's ideology. Then this is meant to be part of a national unifying plank in the nation-building puzzle. The other course, of course, is Islamic Studies, which on the surface of it, you would think, actually, this is really good. I was asked once at a big public panel what I thought of religious education, and I contrasted the United Kingdom, which has religious education as compulsory, with the United States, which did not when I was a child. And the difference was that you hardly see a British person who succumbs to that really crazy, fantastical, evangelical nonsense. They're all over the place in the States. And I think the difference is that British kids learn something that's kind of standard about the Bible. They learn something about their religion, which is curtailed. You're not allowing the nut jobs to come in and teach your religion. And in the US, it's not in the school at all. So everyone is learning it from whatever their pastor decides to give them. And if their pastor is a crazy fanatic, then that's what kids learn, and that's what people learn about Christianity. Well, Islam could be very well taught in schools. We are told exactly which surah, which parts of the Quran to teach. We must teach those. Students must effectively memorize those, and we are told the interpretation that should go with that. Now, of course, we do this, right? This is the requirement to stay open. So we do this. We have other courses which then give students an opportunity to critically reflect on why the state chose those surah, why the state chose those interpretations over others. Because of course we have Aga Khan on the door, which means our chancellor of the university is an Ismaili Shia. He is not Sunni. He does not come from that same stable that gave us those prescribed surah, those prescriptive surah. So we have a duty to our students to help them understand the context of why they're learning Islamic studies in the way they are. Now, you could say that slightly undermines the nation building efforts, but it's not our intent. We are very much working towards kind of unified Pakistan, where citizens build that social capital between one another, but we are up against a top-down propaganda machine, which is actually not designed to do that. It is designed much more to divide. And I think right now we are seeing quite obvious division. We have a caretaker government as of 9th of August, a caretaker government which is by law supposed to only last for 3 months. They have just in the last few days declared that the next election will take place on 8th of February, which is, if you count that, 6 months. So that's a little bit longer than the maximum time allowed for a caretaker government. I'm not holding my breath for that 8th of February election. It may happen. I hope it happens. But I would not be at all surprised if there's yet another delay, which then further irritates people, it angers people, it erodes confidence in the government. And so what you wind up having is the same old playbooks out of 1920s, 1930s Europe, where you scapegoat people, you identify someone that will be a distraction. And so the scapegoating is a you scapegoat a rhetorically identifiable community. It doesn't actually have to be a community that has a lot in common, but you identify them, you say, these are the ones, we ring fence them, they're bad. You pit the ethno-cultural interests of one group against another, and as you've heard multiple times from multiple speakers, you weaponize identity. So the current crisis is really focused around Afghans. Afghans have been scapegoated for some time. There's an estimated 4 million Afghans in Pakistan. 1.7 million of them apparently don't have documentation. In October, the interim caretaker government issued an expulsion order. 1st of November, all of these 1.7 million undocumented Afghans had to leave the country. To be fair to the government, they didn't specify Afghan, they said undocumented migrants. That means all undocumented migrants. The majority of them will be Afghans, but there are going to be a few others. There are stories of the police ripping up Afghans' documentation. So they stop them, they find the documentation, they rip it up. I can't verify those stories, but you hear those stories often enough and think, okay, this is a problem that we do have to look into. But 1st of November, 1.7 million people are supposed to leave the country, are supposed to have left the country. Now, this article from Dawn, 16th of October, I want you to just look at that picture. I mean, when the first time I was at one of these Sindhi nationalist rallies, Sindh is a lovely province, and I'm not knocking Sindh, but there is a Sindhi nationalist party, there's a couple of them, and they adopt these very familiar red flags. Anyone who knows the kind of aesthetics of 1930s Germany will recognize where this is coming from. They don't have swastikas, but they have like a hammer or a sickle, they have some kind of axe in the middle of this red flag with a white circle, a white field, and the nationalists are calling for the expulsion of others. So at this point in time, when you talk about a nationalist party in Pakistan, there's the Awami National Party, which has effectively become a Pashtun party. You have the Sindhi nationalist parties, which is a Sindhi party. So national in Pakistan doesn't mean Pakistan. It means something below Pakistan. So where we are using identity to kind of link people, and it's actually, just as you heard this morning, it is an oppositional, binding together. So the scope for reimagining the sort of national cohesion, the founding of Pakistan was certainly driven by an ethno-religious affiliation, but Islam, despite being an overwhelming majority religion, has not proven to be any kind of a unifier for the country. That Islam by itself is not what is certainly not working out the way Quaid-e-Azam wanted to be, the founding father of Pakistan wanted it to be. And even worse than that, there is a kind of whole international machinery designed to undermine whatever unity between Muslims might exist. The top-down slogans haven't worked. Some people have tried the Indus Valley heritage to invoke a kind of pre-Islamic moment in time when actually Pakistan was, not Pakistan, but the Indus Valley civilization was the world leader in a secularist organization, trade-built, trade-driven. It wasn't driven around kings. So if you've seen the film Mohenjo-daro, throw that out of your mind. I don't think the real Mohenjo-daro was anything like that film. There's common enemies. They have used that time and time again to try and bring about some kind of national unity. That's been pretty disastrous for Pakistan. We got to admit that hasn't worked out well. Harnessing the global diaspora, in some ways, bringing the global diaspora in has been good. It has raised some standards of service delivery, But of course, when people leave the country, they leave with whatever snapshot of time existed when they were there, and they hang on to that, and they preserve that. So I have spoken to many diaspora who cannot get beyond India as the existential enemy to Pakistan. In Pakistan, actually, many people have moved on from that. They have recognized that there are a number of enemies, including climate change, and India is not the kind of top-ranked enemy at the moment. But the diaspora will come back and keep that animosity alive. I'm now going to stop because I'm running out of time, and I'm hoping that Bruce will pick this up to look at how the old OECD ENIC method can actually give us something that is a little more grassroots driven, bottom-up driven, to try and identify the different ways we can dispel some of these stereotypes, some of these narratives, some of these rhetoric about the other in a way that might help Pakistan create some of that national cohesion without sacrificing the pluralism that everyone on the panels this morning said that we actually do cherish. I would say thank you very much. Happy to take it.
Thanks for the time. And there's a question so that I can also reach the time. Any questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Leon. I'm Zafar Khan. I'm from Pakistan. I'm doing my PhD from Griffith University. Thank you very much for presenting Pakistan. It's different the face of Pakistan, the political, religious, or others. My question is that you talked about nation building. So although there are many groups, ethnic groups, linguistic groups, and even in religious, there are many religious groups. So which group is more contributing for nation building in Pakistan? So could you please, and I have another question, the current deportation of Afghan refugees, what will be the impact on political and economic scale, the deportation of this Afghan refugees? Is it a good decision in this time because the caretaker government is there, the political instability is there, the economic crisis is there? So how do you see this the current scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. Both good questions. I'll take the first one. Which community might contribute more? Well, I lived for many years in Punjab, and in the Punjabi mindset, I don't know where you're from, but in Punjab, Pakistan is Punjab, right? These others are they're just there along the way. You're from where? Gilgit-Baltistan. Okay, so Gilgit-Baltistan definitely feels like it's being hard done by, right? Gilgit-Baltistan, yeah, they're not allowed to vote in the National Assembly elections. They're not allowed to vote president. So GB, Gilgit-Baltistan, definitely has been, in many ways, symbolically and materially excluded, right, from much of the nation building. Punjab has not. So Punjab, if you're spending time in Punjab, you would think this is Pakistan. The problem is Balochistan and Sindh and KP don't get on board with that. So Punjab is what, 60% of the population? It is the majority. The 18th Amendment should have split Punjab up. That would have gone a long way towards creating greater equity between the provinces. I don't believe the 18th Amendment will ever be implemented in that way. We will never see a South Punjab. That's never happening. So I don't think Punjab is contributing the way it thinks it is towards a national identity. Karachi is definitely not, because Karachi, like Gilgit, thinks it's being hard done by, thinks that all of its wealth is being sucked off by Punjab. That's a very rude way to say it, but it's being extracted unfairly by Punjab. I don't think that's entirely fair, but it is true that Karachi's roads are not nearly as good as Lahore's roads. If you go to Lahore, you think public transportation is good, safe, clean. Karachi's public transportation is functional for a few months every year, and then after they've done the refurbishment, it drops again. So I don't know. I wouldn't say one community contributes more than the other. They all probably think they can contribute more, except for GB and Balochistan, which know they're excluded. Right? So those two groups know they're excluded. The others think we're the heart of Pakistan. Your other question, Afghan, I mean, I can't see a good outcome for expelling 1.7 million people. They gave them weeks' notice. So a few days before the caretaker government issued the announcement, I was at a dinner with several prominent people. And the after-dinner talks were all about how 80% of crime is committed by Afghans. 80% of murders, 80% of rapes, 80% of this and that. And I'm saying, where do these numbers come from? This is crazy. I mean, I know that Afghans have been the target for this. People have been accusing them for a long time, but we simply don't have reliable data on crime statistics and ethnicity in Pakistan to be able to say anything like that. But they were clearly announced that a few days later, not the law, the executive order came out that they were all to be expelled. Now, many of these 1.7 million Afghans have been born in Pakistan. Many of them, their children, they have lived there their entire lives. They do not have a connection to Afghanistan except through their parents. Many of them, 700,000 Afghans came after 2021 when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. Those 700,000, many of them worked for the United States or worked for the British or worked for one of the coalition forces. Their odds of being killed going back are not trivial. So I think it's unconscionable that any government would send people who may be killed back to Afghanistan. There are 15 million people living in Afghanistan now, living in critical food insecurity. How are they going to handle an extra 1.7 million? I don't see how this does anything other than create greater instability in Afghanistan, which is going to come back to Pakistan, and greater instability in Pakistan as 1.7 million people, many of whom are in Karachi, who played a role not in Karachi's criminal activity, but in other, sort of off the radar economic activities. So how many drivers don't have documentation? How many housekeepers? How many other things that actually the city kind of relies on depends on these people without documentation. It's the same in southern United States. If you took out all the undocumented workers in Texas, the economy would collapse. Now, I don't think Pakistan's economy is as dependent on these 1.7 million people as the US economy is on the Central American workers, but it's still a major blow. 1.7 million people is hard to accommodate one way or the other. So I think it was a mistake. I think the precipitous nature of it, giving them a few weeks to relocate, is cruel. And I mean, I defer to Chip, but I suspect that would be a human rights violation. I suspect this would not stand up to a court internationally. And I'm saying this on a YouTube thing, knowing that I have to go back to Pakistan, and I well might be met by Colonel Saab saying, Steve, you've got to keep your mouth shut. But there are some things that are very important to just be very honest about. And I think this is one that I have a lot of respect for the government of Pakistan. The problems they face, not trivial. I would not want to be in their position, but this one is cruel and unusual, and to be done by a caretaker government whose job should be to facilitate elections. I'm not too shy about saying I think this was a mistake.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, Pakistani politics, it's even more dangerous than the Israel-Palestine thing. Yes.
Maybe it's a question for a comment. I think it's interesting to hear about it because I don't know where they work and there's similar patterns that you see. I wonder, because I think a lot of times when we think about identity weaponization, we go to the most extremes, right? We go to current land conflicts where people saying, how am I supposed to sit down with this person or understand that this person's human, blah, blah, blah. But I think what your case is a nice illustration. I was thinking about that work before it gets to those moments. I wonder if you maybe comment on that.
I think it's an excellent point. Pakistanis, by and large, do get along with one another. So I lived in northern Punjab at a time when the Afghan refugees were coming through in large numbers in the late 90s, and people accommodated, right? I mean, they said horrible things, right? What comes out of their mouths is often racist, but then they gave them land to work. They gave them housing. So they were not rhetorically nice. They didn't sound like gentle people. They weren't saying, they were not following the rules of I don't know what rules. I wanted stepping on a toe, but they were in material ways very supportive. At the peak, I've heard estimates as high as 6 million Afghans in Pakistan. And what I did not hear through the 80s and 90s when I was going to Pakistan was the kind of rhetoric you hear in Europe about the 55,000 Syrians that went to the UK, right? So I was part of a group that helped kind of welcome some Syrians into County Durham in the north of England. We had to bring them in the middle of the night in small numbers. We had to distribute them around the county so that no one would know where they are. And you never found that in Pakistan, right? Basically, people were accommodating. So I think that's something we could build on. What's happening now seems to me very clearly the weaponization of an identity, and it is a scapegoating exercise designed to distract people from the fact that there are some serious problems, and I'm not pointing fingers about who the problems are caused by, but the problems are real, and they're not going to be fixed by a short IMF loan. They require much more long-term thinking, which the caretaker government simply doesn't have the mandate to do, and they know they won't be there. So this is their attempt to maintain some kind of order, which, as I say, it's not easy to do. So I'm not blaming those individuals. I think this is cruel, but I think we do have an opportunity, as you say, to get long before we have a lot of these open conflicts. We could be working with the Afghan and Pakistanis in Karachi, a place like Karachi, which has them all, to try and help people understand what that other is and how that other fits, complements my group.
That's great. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Sandra, for giving up the time. We're going to have now Bruce White, who's the founding director of the Organization for Identity and Cultural Development. Bruce, I would also like to ask you, if you don't mind, to just speak a few words and Sandra can give the extra time about the OICD, because I think that we didn't do this enough in the morning, explaining what the organization is too. We is partnering with the University of Cambridge with legal research for organizing research. And Bruce is going to talk about incorporating identity factors into education and art education policy and programming for transformation.
Great, thanks so much, Joanna. Could I just ask you to help putting that up then, if I'm
You can, but not
double
with
click
those
to make sure
computers.
where it's going. So hi everyone, and thanks for organising this again, Joanna. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to be in a position to just talk very briefly about the OICD, Organisation for Identity and Cultural Development. I think it's very relevant, of course, to the talks we've had to consider the ways in which, as many of the speakers, I think everybody, has talked about the challenges of incorporating identity factors into policy.
Do you have a problem?
It's on there, I've double clicked it, it's there.
This is the one. Yeah, apologies. Keep going.
Okay,
Mhm.
what does that say?
No, there's a problem.
Oh dear.
Yeah, we might want to, yeah.
Okay.
So just a second, we have a technical problem. Can you help me? I think that the PowerPoint is cracking or something like that.
I opened it.
So we might have not finished or something.
I don't need,
There we go, but-
oh, there it is.
Here you go.
Right.
Sorry, Bruce.
No problem.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. So I will be talking about this sort of during my actual quick talk here, but it's interesting to reflect on, what tools do we have to measure identity, to research identity, and to make identity communicable to policymakers. We have social science tools, right? We have the ability to talk to people about how they think, talk to people about the symbols, the binary us and them versions that link them to a world of meaning, about what it means to be them in whatever context. But the context in which we've heard about, ranging from Richard's talk this morning on public health to the talk Steve's just given on national identity building, social cohesion, they are so diverse. Sometimes we need to understand how identity appears to people in a very individual way, in a very small scale way, how they think about their communities, how they think about their political party. Sometimes we need to understand how they think about their nation states, their ethnic groups, their religious groups, as Steve's been referencing. So we have a broad spectrum of challenges, and we need tools to help us organize, communicate, research, and ultimately to come up with some kind of strategy, as I think all of the talks have kind of teed us up to understand. What do we do with this information once we have it? How do we help to build policies that can address these multiple problems? So that's what we're really interested in doing in the OECD, to develop tools for research. And I'm going to be talking about some of those and some of the case studies from our work now. So I just want to reference a couple of sectors here that we've worked on that, again, connect with what people have been speaking about today. We're very interested in the OECD in the most challenging human context, and we've heard a lot about many of them this morning and this afternoon, violent conflict and violent extremism, right? Identity fuels, as we've heard, the us and them binaries of our lives, and those us and them binaries lead us to attack people that are not like us or mobilize us, as Sandra was talking about, towards violence and conflict is identity and conflict is a very well-researched field. Polarization, as Sandra was talking about, persecution, discrimination of minorities, as we've just heard features of. We've also got identity embedded in education, how as children, what it means to be us, we've got an opportunity to expand those versions of what it means to be us. And we learn very early on about what it means to craft an identity as children. And so identity education is a hugely underexplored area that we're very interested in developing practitioner tools around, teacher education courses and so on. Identity formation is a theoretical field in and of itself. So again, this is a hugely broad set of challenges that we have to work with identity more consciously, more systematically, more deliberately, and to come up with tools and processes that can help us address universal human problems. So what we've seen as an organization working across these different sectors is that effectively bridging research and policy involves taking account of three interrelated challenges. And I want to just flag up those three. Okay. So the first one is making sure that the research findings, that it could be coming from anthropology, psychology, history, legal studies, communication studies, a whole range of different disciplines. How are we communicating this research to policymakers, right? Sounds a kind of obvious way, obvious factor here, but it normally involves some sort of data transformation. We have the original research, and we've got to convert that research into something that policymakers can get their hands on and sort of, get to grips with. The second point is illustrating how this information, this research, can be converted into some kind of applied strategy. Now, this involves, I've worked on several projects where you've got even very well-written academic articles which explain how the conclusion of the research should influence policy. But if that's just delivered as an academic paper, the practitioners don't necessarily feel that there's a bridge there from the research to practice. Often you need an intermediary stage, which is a platform or a tool set that the practitioners can actually use straight away, that they don't have to convert the research into policy, but you've given them a bridge, which is a set of tools. Like, this is how we do it, a systematic, step-by-step tool set. And the third thing is to be able to present a way of measuring the outcome of the strategies and interventions that your research is going to result in. So these three things, I think, are absolutely essential to bridging science and policy, particularly when we have the challenge of something so intangible as identity. And Steve handed over to me a bit there earlier by sort of saying, how do we detect and how do we begin to even map what identity structures look like, right? These are really intangible things. They're like narratives, images, concepts. They're all abstract. How do we even, begin to map them? So that's another area that we've concentrated on a lot at the OECD. And I'm going to just sort of go now to sort of showing you some of the work that we've done here to try and produce and meet these challenges of making identity factors understandable, able to be converted into interventions and measurable. So the first thing to sort of talk about here is what is at the heart of some of our work, which is identity mapping. Now, this is a very complex diagram. I'm not expecting people to try and absorb any of this, but you can see here, this is actually just one community in Belfast, Northern Ireland. One small community of, I think this was built from about 10 people, 10 ethnographic interviews with 10 individuals from a community in Belfast. And this shows the complexity of concepts and ideas that those individuals are using to construct the world of us and them, right? If you have an opportunity, if you know the context, you might pick up a few words here and there, but here we have ideas of history, of what it means to be part of our ethnic group. We have ideas of what it means to be them, right? So there are clusters here. If you look there, there's a big word, us. You can see all of the concepts that connect to us. And then there are concepts that also connect to them, which is sort of clustered over here. And some of them are religious, some of them are class-based, some of them are about nation, some of them are about ethnicity. But we can map these things if we have a good quality incoming research feed. Now that research can come from ethnographic data. Many of us have talked about ethnographic data. It can also come from interviews, life histories. Again, it can be interdisciplinary research that feeds this kind of work. But importantly, what we're trying to do is illustrate the complexity of possible options that are on the table. And also, over time, compare these different configurations of identity over time. And I'll come on to talk about that. So one of the things that we can do, as I've just mentioned, is this is actually a map of the same community, but it shows that there are different ways of other members in that community of using symbols and ideas to construct their version of identity. So we always see different positions being able to be taken within a particular group of people. And that means that we can compare versions of culture and even posit and design versions which simulate past and future configurations. In this particular version, as I said, in the same community, we see other cultural linkages, other ideas about what it means to be us, other connections to history, other ways of imagining what it means to be a member of this community in the world. We can compare different generations of people from the same community, for example, and we'll see that there are different us and them binaries that those generations attach to. So these kind of mapping and analysis tools allow us to build a platform for strategy, design, and intervention. Such strategies can be designed to, for example, and I've got a couple of points here, counter divisive identities. Once we know that there's a group of people that are using a particular set of images and symbols to attach themselves to a version of us, we can follow those connections and understand where new connections can be introduced or old connections regenerated. Likewise, that's the second point, we can rebuild and regenerate those cultural linkages. So identity-based strategies can also show us where to head. And in a lot of examples, what we see, and this is a very simplistic example of how somebody can be, when we're enacting one identity position, it leads to one version of the other. And if we're able to switch, it leads to a different other, right? So this is actually the same individual that as we swap versions of ourselves from one place to another, the other is defined very differently. And we can see that in any healthy individual, an identity that is not in a position of radicalization, for example. Radicalization, particularly in violent extremism, people stop being able to switch and they lock into a particular position, and the other is only a single other. Now, Amartya Sen, who somebody mentioned today, I can't remember who it was actually. Amartya Sen, anyone remember?
Yeah.
Was it you, Chip? Yeah. Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel Prize winner, who's written a book called Identity and Violence, sees that single identities, being stuck in single identities, is actually the root of violent conflict. And we very much agree with that analysis and have sort of shown it in this mapping of identity and how plural identities can bring people out of violent extremism. So using identity-based strategy and technologies, methods and tools, we can gain access to an otherwise invisible world, an intangible world of representations, and we can understand in great detail why and how people are using these representations to create the binaries that cause the problem. We can use these identity-based strategies, turning them into initiatives that can laser focus on the pluralization of the single identity, right? Transforming a single identity back into a multiple one, providing optionality, pluralization, complexity, all of the things that the identity entrepreneurs that Sandra was talking about are engaged in removing from our political lives. And I think importantly, and this is quite new for us in the OECD, importantly, the ability to compare these configurations over time allows us to measure and track changes in social life, right? And as we've seen, the measurement of these kind of intangible features is very, very difficult ordinarily, right? So we're trying to provide some sort of technology that can allow us to say, okay, this is what it looked like 3 months ago, this is what it looks like now, what's it going to look like in another 3 months? And that gives us an impact analysis tool. How am I doing for time?
13 minutes.
30 minutes in, great. I think more importantly than, because we're kind of catching up with this, one of the underappreciated elements here is that this can also allow us to create our own careful ethical checklists. There is a huge history of doing harm by trying to do good, messing with identities, and being able to slowly plot and visualize what we're doing and come up with carefully crafted strategies allows us to build an ethical checklist of what it is that we shouldn't do and what it is that we need to be really careful of. There's a couple of case studies I don't have time to go into, but wonderful, well-meaning people messing with identities, creating big backlashes, which have made the problems worse rather than better. So I think it's interesting to sort of reflect on the fact that, you know, identity is very difficult to measure, it's very difficult to quantify, it's difficult to use as a platform for building a bridge between science and policy. But by making findings understandable, for showing how the research can be applied through strategy design and intervention, and allowing a system of measurement so that those interventions can be evaluated and tracked, we can go some way to plugging that gap. So I just want to very quickly cover a couple of case studies. So in partnership with UNESCO, we're facilitating a network which can engage in knowledge sharing, research, and best practices in the application of identity-based research around arts, the application of art and arts education. Now, arts education is all about storytelling, either through images, through self-representations, through direct storytelling, thank you very much, through direct storytelling. And as many speakers have already referenced, narrative is such an engine to express identity in the first place. So anything that we're going to do on the intervention side has to reach human hearts and minds, as a couple of people have referenced already. And reaching human hearts and minds, we have to hit an emotional layer of existence, not just an intellectual one. And that requires artistic storytelling techniques. So I would argue in any identity-based intervention, we need to be aware of this storytelling layer and taking advantage of it. And that's one of the things we're doing with UNESCO in East Africa. With Sunrays Foundation in South Sudan, we're looking at the negative manipulation of heritage and culture by militant groups and trying to map what's happening on the ground so that practitioners and NGOs can be much more cognizant of how to outcompete that weaponization of narrative and identity. I've got a few more that I'm just going to skip past because I just want to finish on this one, which I think is interesting. This is work that we've done in Canada, working with narratives and a specialist impact analysis organization. And with them, we've, I think, Richard this morning talked so much about Indigenous identity. And this is a project that was about helping First Nations communities represent their relationship to the environment. And we see here, mapping the identities of a particular First Nations community in Canada, the degree to which well-being is connected in the identity of the community to physical environmental features and topographies and resources. And this research was used, and this strategy was used to communicate that community's relationship to the environment to policymakers in the federal Canadian government who are going to build a highway through that land. So infrastructural policy, government policy of any kind that affects a community, if they have this kind of information, they can have a much deeper understanding of where that community sits, not just physically, but in terms of their social and identity-based feature set, which is obviously what we're very interested in trying to give them the ability to understand. So in the building of effective transformative policy across sectors, it is of immense value for such policies to be grounded in an understanding of identity and cultural context. Achieving this is challenging as identity is initially expressed through intangible symbols, stories, images, and narratives. By innovating ways to visualize and communicate this research, we can start to overcome this limitation. From there, developing strategic intervention building tools and platforms can harness and leverage the opportunities presented by identity-based knowledge, providing a vital bridge to policy and practice and allowing the resulting policy outcomes to be measured and optimized over time. So that's what we're passionate about. Thank you for listening. Over to Greg.
So in front of the fact that we are currently established laws in the European Union because of hybrid wars, because of terrorism and radicalization, like especially in media. I wanted to ask your opinion on digital resilience, especially when it comes to counter and alternative narratives, because I looked into a methodology when it came to networks of actions, like where you actually measured, like similar to what you were just describing, like how opinions are shared and how identities are constructed and how these narratives like evolve. And I would love to know if you have an opinion about digital resilience and if you already look into how to create tools that can be applied on social media, for example.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's such a big topic and an important one, isn't it? Because so much of the popularization work and radicalization goes on online. There are a couple of things to mention there. One, just before I forget, because you mentioned counter narratives, it's very important when looking at counter narratives, and the research on this is only just coming out in the last year or two. It's very important not to put down or criticize negatively even very dangerous narratives. We found that that has a huge backlash effect. It's what happened in 2001 from 9/11, 2001. The counter-narrative story began where the idea was that we could fight fire with fire. So negative weaponized narratives should be fought with positive weaponized narratives, or basically, tearing these things down and saying how terrible they are. But to go back to a point that Sandra made, because identity expressions are fueled by universal human needs, if you attack somebody's narrative, all it does is hurt them, right? So what we found is we call this, we distinguish between creating counter narratives and creating what we call equal alternative narratives. And that involves understanding the needs that the negative weaponized narrative is meeting, right? And then working out how to also meet that need without necessarily having to demonize the weaponized narrative, right? And that's a much more effective approach. And it's not just us that have developed this. This is, there's new and emerging research that comes out that's showing this very clearly. But we are still, many of us, many practitioners across Europe, in particular, well-meaning NGOs that haven't caught up, and it's dangerous, right? We need to be very careful about that. Counter-narrative production is dangerous, and we need to have a very clear understanding of the psychological effects of attacking a narrative in any way. In terms of the digital side, it's, I think, very important to make the distinction between the identities that are generated within social media, which are not necessarily the same identities that we would have in regular interactive life. But that doesn't go any way to sort of mitigate against the profound danger of online radicalization, which is a real thing. I mean, there are several people that are working to identify the communities that are vulnerable, online communities that are vulnerable to certain sorts of identity radicalization, identify those communities and inject intelligent, sophisticated, equal alternative narratives into those spaces. There's a woman called Anne Speckard, who Steve probably knows, who does this kind of work. And a lot of it is actually to do with identifying those online spaces where this stuff is being dangerously reproduced. And that's difficult, right? But there are people that are doing it, and there are good organizations in Europe.
Yeah, here in Portugal we have or had, I'm not sure, maybe Joanna knows that, something called Reset to Unite. And then we work mainly with like religious minority groups, or maybe we go more this, I don't know, but super interesting. Okay.
Yeah, there's lots to say. We could have a workshop on just that theme, couldn't we? Yeah. Thank you.
Any other question? Here and then here, Cash, go ahead.
First, I'd like to congratulate you for this amazing measurement you and the team created. And I'd like to know that first, how can you recreate a bond that has been severed between two groups? Just like Sandra talked about populism, where things like this happens. How can you create a bond between this and create let's say a pluralistic us instead of us and them? Also, my second question is, do you believe it's feasible to create a country, a state, which is not based on a national identity or based on the religious identity, but rather based on a goal where people can share land and preserve it also? Let's say a country based on humanity rather than I'm German, I'm French.
Sure, no, great.
Sorry, first, can we take the last?
Yeah,
one and
sure.
then you answer it all?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
So I was wondering if at least the picture you showed us reminded me of neural networks.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you incorporate deep learning, especially in predicting the outcomes, and if so, if you also face the problem that people do when they deal with neural networks and data science, that they get so complex and there's so many variables that there is a certain outcome, but you can't really track down the reasons or the causes, the minimal variables that led to that outcome. That's the problem you face.
Yeah, great. Okay, let me start there and then go back. So,
I have the question.
oh, okay, okay, great. So neural networks, yeah, exactly. And what's so interesting about building this kind of semantic network is that you realize that people, and this is, I say you realize, you see visually the kind of deep theoretical work that has gone into identity, understanding identity in the past. So for instance, there's a great theory that talks about quantum shifts, like that switch I showed you earlier. So when we imagine a neural network, we think of the brain firing. We use that word firing, and it creates this pathway through our brain, right, as the synapses fire one by one. Identity works in a very similar way, right? So if I'm presenting myself to you as like an expert on identity, there are certain touchstones I'm going to use, right? But then if I talk to Joanna as somebody that I know, other pathways will fire. And it's possible for me to be many versions of myself as quickly as my brain is capable of, which is very quickly, right? So that's a really useful understanding and a really sophisticated way, I think, to understand the possibilities that any individual human has to express culture, because these neural networks are cultural images and symbols, right? Now, it is up to us how much detail we get. So we've had contexts where we've mapped tens of thousands of possible symbols and ideas, or we can map 100. That map I showed you at the beginning is probably 500 or something, maybe 1,000 edges in that network. And you can just stop at any point. And the difficulty that we have faced is not necessarily at the network analysis stage, it's understanding what networks to map in the first place and how detailed to get in that mapping. And that is very dependent on the problem that we're looking at. So if we're looking at, say, digital radicalization, right, then, and it's a certain type of terrorist, let's say, in Europe, or it's about polarization, we can hone our research questions to a very specific sort of area of those neural networks, that neural network. That could be, for instance, a lot of radicalization of terrorists, it happens around masculinity. So we focus on mapping masculinity and the possible cultural ideas of masculinity within a particular community, for instance. But there's also religious ideas, there's ethnic ideas. So you can kind of hone in and get the complexity that you think you need in order to come up with something viable on the strategy end. So that is often a research decision rather than an analytical analysis decision, if you see what I mean. But it's that's great to sort of see it as a neural network. I completely agree. Great way of doing it. Is it possible to have a nation state? Have I still got time?
Yeah.
Is it possible to have a nation state? Just remind me what you were saying. Was it without
being based on a national identity, because nationalism is a great and not the years.
Sure.
And also based on religion. And my first question was, how can we create songs or sad.
That's right, yeah, yeah. Well, we were talking earlier, I think America, the early version of America, unfortunately not the version that we're seeing right now in our last 10 years or so, but early versions of America were about creating a national identity around celebration of difference as sameness, right? So it is possible to create, narratives which don't necessarily have to have an other to target and say you are different, therefore you are not like us. The original idea of America, as we all know, was that it doesn't matter where you're from, you're American. That actually happens to have been tried in many nation states over time, right? Now, to regenerate, and the other nice thing to think about here is not just the positive examples of how this is done on a national level, but also reflect on, and we all know this, if we have children or if we've seen kids or we just have an intuitive understanding of how hate works, you actually have to teach people to hate, right? So the default sort of social configuration of identity is adaptive. We are kind of defaulting on optionality and being able to change identity to suit situation. Otherwise, we'd be all in a much more, and some of us, of course, in some societies are in a very polarized position, but we would have nothing like the same degree to be adaptable as social animals if identity worked in a different way. So one of the implicit in your question, I think, is, what is the default? What is healthy? How does identity work originally before somebody comes in and starts teaching you that this other group is bad and you should hate them? We have an adaptive system. The system is inherently adaptive and it requires external modification and weaponization, right? Or manipulation, negative manipulation, in order to channel those neural networks down one pathway that ends up in hatred or persecution of another. So that's really good because it gives us some hope that the default position is just what we need to get back to. So often when we arrive in a place to do this kind of mapping work, what we find, and I often, when we're training organizations in how to do this, I talk about it as arriving on a crime scene. You arrive at a scene where options have been removed by identity entrepreneurs. And you get there and you say, well, now which options have been removed? You have to do a bit of detective work. And you work out, okay, well, before these identity entrepreneurs came along, you could be Moroccan French and not sort of think that masculinity was the most important thing to protect about yourself. Or you could think that you were Hutu, and to be Hutu didn't mean that you had to hate Tutsi, right? Or whatever the context. When we arrive somewhere, things have been disrupted in a negative way that have removed optionality from people's lives. So the question can be reversed, right? Not is it possible, how is it possible to make these connections, but how can we identify what has gone wrong and return people to a position where they did have those options in the first place? But it's a fascinating way of looking at it, right? Like, how can we think of returning options? Now, practically,
how can we return to a state where, if we really think about it, borders don't make any sense. We're human beings living here for the past 10,000 years, millions of years. So there's no really rationality between, I can go to this country because I'm not part of it. This doesn't make any sense. It's just creation.
Yeah, well,
how can we go back to a state where, okay, we're just humans, can collectively try and do good for everyone, despite the language or the food I eat?
So I would say, Sandra's said this earlier, identities are here to stay. Identities have a structure, they have predictable ways in which they operate. For us to understand how identity works in us, and that we are driven to produce us and them binaries, but that those binaries don't have to be ones that end up in persecution, right? That's one way of thinking about that question. But we also can't be complacent and sort of say, well, throw our hands up in the air and say there's nothing we can do about identities that end up in a persecutory configuration, right? That's also negligent, because there are things we can do about that, and we can talk more over coffee about how we do that, perhaps. But thank you.
Sorry, we're gonna have to move on, so I'm gonna be really strict, sorry.
Okay,
We're gonna move on.
we just say that one thing primates do have guns.
Yeah.
We didn't invent this. This is very
That's a
Very
very
good.
good point, that's a very good point. Sorry, thank you so much for.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, our next speaker is someone that we all know, is our hostess, Joanna. She is a researcher here at the University of Coimbra Institute for Legal Research, that's the acronym, UICLER. And her presentation will be looking at incorporating an understanding of historical narratives on identity, conflict transformation, reconciliation policy.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sandra, and for continuing this job of being the host. So let me see if I can do this quickly. PowerPoint, yeah. So, okay, so I'm sorry, this is not my computer, I'm kind of slow in doing those things. No, this is not going to work. No, just a second. Yeah, I guess we could have been talking for longer, right? Okay. So I never know what to do with those computers. I'm deeply sorry. Okay. There we go, right? Luis, can you just check in the computer's working? Yeah, right? Okay, so thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking, just like Sandra said, about incorporating an understanding of historical narratives on identities and culture into conflict transformation and reconciliation policy. So this work comes from a book I have published this year. I'm not trying to sell you my book. Actually, I am, but it is open access. So you can just download it for free and read it. And if you don't like it, there's no problem. You didn't spend your money. So it's in the Palgrave Macmillan website, in the Rethinking Peace and Conflict Study series, or if you just Google the name of the book, you're going to find it and you can have the whole PDF for free. So this book is a research that I have developed for many years that began actually with an attempt to look for alternative approaches to peacemaking, because I was very much disappointed by peace processes and how top-level peace processes were managing to deal with questions such as reconciliation, identities, narratives. And I started to look for other types of alternatives, but then I realized it must come from the top. I mean, it must come from elite level politics, because if it doesn't, we can't create the basic conditions for a conflict transformation to begin with. This is the actual case of what's been going on in Israel and Palestine. I'm not going to talk about this right now. If you're interested, we can discuss later. But one of the things that is part of what we need to do right now is a ceasefire, for then to be able to start discussing reconciliation, historical narratives, and identity, because first thing is to stop people being killed. So I decided to look into the peace process, and the puzzle of my book is actually a question that is, so if there has been a peace process for so long taking place in Israel and Palestine, and it wasn't being able to build peace, what it's been doing? Has it any impact on conflicts, or on the contrary, it's just happening and nothing happens? And then what I realized is that it does have an impact on conflict, even when it fails. And I'm going to talk to you about this in a short while. So the main argument of my book is that those policies, narratives, norms, and practices that are associated with peace processes and those policies, they have a double potential. They can affect identities in conflict by promoting dehumanization, which is ongoing. So it helps reinforce this process. It can bring about reconciliation. So super quickly, I was looking into those relationships between the persistence and increase of violence in those kind of conflicts while we have an ongoing peace process. And as I told you, I was looking into the definitions and how the peace processes were impacting identities in conflict in the long run. So during the conflict. So why peace processes, right? Because my presentation today is not about peace processes, it's about conflict transformation and reconciliation policy. But peace processes are important here because reconciliation policy is actually translated into peace processes framework. So the first time we heard about reconciliation was actually in 1992 in the Boutros Ghali's Agenda for Peace, Preventive Diplomacy, Peacemaking, and Peacekeeping.
which is a document that was produced by the United Nations with the end of the Cold War, in which we have a huge change in the international peace architecture. And the idea here was to construct a sequential process in which we would act as an international community after the end of the bipolar conflict with the two main powers of the Cold War. And that could work to solve all of those conflicts, those long-term conflicts that were still taking place, mainly after the end of the Second World War, and mainly also due to decolonization. So this sequential idea of promoting peace that is part of the Agenda for Peace began with, well, we need first to sit down and start talking, and then we have an agreement, which is a written agreement. Then we build state institutions, and mainly liberal state institutions and liberal market institutions, and create a constitution and guarantee people have the right to vote and participate in democratic processes. And then after all of this is achieved, we start talking about reconciliation, and then we create conditions for a sustainable peace. So reconciliation would be the framework that would bring about sustainable peace and would guarantee that the peace that we have, first, in a very negative terms, which is the opposite of war, ceasefire, agreement, elites sit down, they agree that we are going to produce peace now. In the end of the day, it leads to reconciliation, and then we're never gonna have conflicts again. But then those conflicts in the 90s that were managed this way, they failed. Mozambique is one of the most clear examples nowadays. That was the huge success case of the UN. And there are many others, including Israel and Palestine, which had Oslo agreements in the 90s that were not, in fact, implemented. So they were like half implemented. This way, we have the Palestinian Authority nowadays. But the question here is that those processes, they become kind of an episodic thing after the 90s. So most of the attempts by the international community to reach a peace agreement were a response to an escalation of violence. You can see right now that what's been going on in Israel and Palestine is we're talking again about a peace process. We're talking again about putting people back together, to put elites together, to find new people with whom we can talk, who are the legitimate leaders. So this is what happens when we have an escalation of violence. But before then, just like our Secretary General of the United Nations has stated and was very much criticized, but I absolutely disagree about that. He said what happened in October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum. And he's right. So we are dealing with this conflict, which is a protected conflict beginning at least in 1947, but maybe in the beginning of the 20th century. And we're dealing with it again and again and again and repetitively now again, as if it had happened in the beginning of October. But this is not what happens. And what happens in the peace processes is that when you deal with conflict in such an episodic way, the result that you have is you don't deal with identity issues, and then you keep creating conflict. So to move forward a little bit, I have come up with this idea of the protected peace processes. So this is a concept of mine that I think that helps explain what goes on in those kinds of conflicts. That is, when you have a protected conflict, several attempts to build peace, they coexist with conflict. So we can say that they are only peace processes since the 90s, because it's when the international community started to frame those things like that. But the initiatives that began before that, they're also part of the so-called peace process. So if you look at them from a historical perspective, we can realize that they have been impacting conflict, that they have been transformed into a structure in conflict, not just a material structure, meaning the peace process per se, in the moments in which we are negotiating, but also as a symbolic structure, because people say the peace process is dead, but then you have an escalation of violence, and then peace process comes back again, and people talk about peace process, so it exists in a symbolic way for people. It's ever there. If it's all the time acting, even in a symbolic way, then it's got a consequence in how people frame themselves. And one of the things that I have found out by looking deeply into the Israeli-Palestinian case, and now I've been working with other colleagues to try to expand this framework to other cases, is that when you have a protected peace process, the very meaning of peace process changes across time. And what you see is that the idea of process gains primacy over the objective of peace. So the ever-going, the forever ongoing process
becomes a normalization. And this is important because peace processes that can become another arena for conflict. Peace processes are the place in which political elites, they talk to their nationals, they talk to international communities, so they try to legitimize themselves. And because of that, the peace process is also a place in which we perform conflict. And we can even bring about new grievances, and we can introduce new other topics into conflict through those very mediatic peace processes that then reflect on how people interact. So my main argument in this book is that the peace process can risk freezing the conflict into a negative peace when it fails to address the root causes of the conflict, mainly connected to identity needs like recognition, belonging, existing, having rights, having self-determination. And then when this happens, the peace process might even deepen conflict. So we're doing things in the wrong way. The protected conflict, it can give way to the protected peace process. So I'm bringing very quickly a table that I have drafted in my book, which is connected to the time dimensions and characteristics of those protected peace processes. One of the things that I found out is that the past is only dealt with after the formal peace process. So the idea that we should talk to people and deal with narratives and discuss relationships is something that comes later. So the past doesn't matter right now. We'll deal with the past in the future. So not a problem. Right now, we're just dealing with the moment, the present. So the present then is acted in a very action-reaction manner. So we need to deal with the present right now only when we have escalation of violence. And then we are dealing with the present in a reactive way to just deal with what's going on right now. That is obviously a product of the past and memories and trauma and everything that had been going on before, which is obviously the main point of our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And then the future is also for later, because then we are always concentrating on the present and present manifestations of conflict. And this doesn't work, right? Because and unfortunately, I think this is not going to happen, but if we manage to bring Israel to the table of negotiations and create a ceasefire right now, what we're going to see is that people are going to write agreements and release hostages and deal with what's been going on and create safe passages and humanitarian clauses. But then the real thing that led people to radicalize, to feel that they don't have a hope in life, to feel that they need to continue in this conflict or that violence is the only way forward, this is not discussed at all. And then when mediatization goes away, we just forgot about the peace process and wait for this to happen again. This is something that I have been saying a lot in media, and I've heard other people saying too, that is, what happened is as tragic and sad as it is predictable and expectable. So what happened right now, for anyone who knows the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was something that we were waiting for it to happen, which is sad because we could have been dealing with it before and we could have prevented a huge catastrophe that has happened in Israel and now is happening in Gaza. So reconciliation. Reconciliation is seen as cooperative projects in the agenda for peace. So the idea is to reduce hostile perceptions through educational exchanges, curriculum reforms. So the idea is that we create a new narrative that can reduce hostilities. John Paul Lederach has talked about this in the end of the 90s too, because he said that reconciliation is actually a process of relationship building, and we shouldn't be looking at reconciliation as the last stage of this process. Reconciliation is ongoing. Reconciliation is the everyday process in which we create relationships, we bring people together, and we encourage opposing sides to articulate their pain, the past, to envision a new future. Well, the point is that this is not how reconciliation is incorporated into policy. Reconciliation is ever ongoing, but political processes only look at it like after we deal with the problems, we'll look at this thing. So one of the things that I have also conceptualized is that we have coexisting dynamics in conflict. We have dehumanization on the one hand, but then we have another thing that I call peaceless reconciliation, borrowing a concept from Anat Biletsky, who is also an Israeli, writing about this. I have a little slightly different interpretation of peaceless reconciliation than the one that she had, but I think that the concept is brilliant because it brings about the idea that reconciliation is always there, even though if it's not a top-down imposed policy, it's happening on the ground. And we can see this clearly if we go to Israel nowadays, because there's reconciliation happening every day. And I'm skipping this. We can talk later about the impact of protected peace processes and conflict, because I'm not going to have a lot of time to do it. So going into the historical narratives, they can be transformative in the sense that they provide ontological security to beings, meaning that people feel secure about their existence. This is one of the things that seems to me super clear that it's been going on in Israel right now. Netanyahu has been framing the war against Gaza and against Hamas as an existential conflict, as the second war of independence. Luckily, Israel is the clearly established country in the region. So why is he doing this? He's manipulating, as he's been doing for a long time, the very existential threat that Jews feel, because it's a trauma that goes with people intergenerationally for at least 2,000 years. The idea that these people can cease existing. And this collective trauma that is embedded in collective memory, and collective memory can't be collectively remembered, so it is narrated, right? So part of our collective memory doesn't have to be part of our lived experiences. It's something that comes with us through the way we narrate our history, our past, our memories. And in this sense, this ontological insecurity, I must stop talking. So this ontological insecurity that is felt by Israel is something that has always been somehow projected into Palestinians when the Zionist movement started to immigrate and started to reproduce narratives of the lack of existence of a people, the fact that there was nobody there, it was an empty land for new people who needed to establish a state. And those kind of things created a self-reinforcing dynamic. So if we can transform this narrative back into something that creates a mutual understanding of the past, and the idea that where someone has lost their house, another person has found one, this is something that can be transformative. And I'm not talking just by head about cool ideas on how to transform conflict. I've seen this in Israel and Palestine. Those kind of projects, they exist. Projects that try to reframe narratives. But the question is that narratives can also be instrumentalized by political elites, and they are, in the other way around. So they are also weaponized. And the question is how to overcome this. I think that we've talked a lot today on how to overcome this. So I'm not going to go into detail on this. But the challenge here is how to scale up those kind of initiatives that exist. I'm thinking about things, for example, when Sandra talked about we looking for the other common types of identification that we have, for example, being a mother. There is a very interesting movement in Israel and Palestine, which is a bereaved family circle. So people just join to mourn, and they recognize themselves as parents who lost their children, and not as Israelis or Jews or Arabs or Palestinians or tall or small or fat or thin people. They're just looking at the things that they have in common and how this conflict has been affecting them in their everyday life. So the question is how to scale this up. The idea that I'm bringing here is that we need to incorporate those kind of things into top-level policy by historicizing these processes in a sense, and by historicizing, avoiding episodic approaches, but also by dealing with conflict transformation as something that is connected to identity transformation and not just ceasing fire or reducing direct types of violence. There is a simultaneity that must be addressed here between top-down and bottom-up initiatives. And actually, this happens. So the opportunities that I find, and this is my last slide, I promise you, is that there is something that I have found in Israel and Palestine that I call subcontracting peace. So the question is, while the international community has stepped away from trying to solve Israeli-Palestinian conflict through top-down agreements, what's been going on in the societal level is actually that people have been organizing themselves and they have been acting. And one of the things that has been going on is that the European Commission, for example, the European Union, has been investing a lot in those kind of projects that try to bring people together. How can we scale this up? We can invest more. So this is something that has been going on. There's a peace process going on all the time, even when we don't talk about this in the media and with political elites. And supporting those kind of projects and empowering people to take the leadership in building peace is one of the ways that I think that should be clearly incorporated into peace processes policies. And this is one of the ways that I'm proposing here today. So that's it. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. Brilliant, as always. My question is on the reconciliation point. I noticed you had a frame, the slide, make hummus not walls or something like that.
Yeah.
Have you heard about what happened? Exchanges, friendships that develop and falling apart.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just falling apart temporarily, but similar things are starting to happen or happen with music commissions. And I hope that it's just a temporary thing because of the discriminative current violence, but the people who develop these friendships over the years, like these two famous chefs, that Palestinians really built their friendship, they are now hostile for each other, even though they didn't fight with violence. So I guess my question is, specifically whether you have in New or not, and also in general, the timing of the reconciliation processes, I'm thinking through the reconciliation commissions and like South Africa and other places. Often they have to happen there because of time limits of time. And so that's the general area. I wonder if the events that are happening now have caused you to revise your book in any way on the role of reconciliation.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to take another question or should I answer?
No, that's right.
Okay. So there are many things in here. One of the things is, I brought a picture of Make Humans Not Walls. This is a picture that I took from the separation wall in Bethlehem. So when you see the separation wall between Israel and Palestine, and sometimes between Palestine and Palestine, you can see that this separation wall has a lot of graffiti in it. And one of the graffiti that I found really interesting is this one, Make Humans Not Walls. This is something that I use a lot in my presentations because what people have told me a lot in Israel and Palestine is that before the Second Intifada in the beginning of the 21st century, people used to have relationships. So they used to buy bread into the Arabic bakery and the other way around. So this is something that existed. And after the Second Intifada, which was a very, very violent one, and the response by the Israeli government with the building of the wall and the separation and the division that was created, not just symbolically, but clearly, physically, this has really moved people apart. And the initiatives that I'm talking about, they are small scale in a sense also because it's difficult just to bring people together. For example, in Gaza, people can't leave, so they can't be part of those initiatives. And people in the West Bank, they can be part of these initiatives, but they have difficulties to cross the border. They need to justify this. They need to go through a checkpoint. And people in Israel, they enter the West Bank with huge signs on the street, like red one saying, this is dangerous for your lives. You can't cross. This is against Israeli law. So people can cross, but they usually don't. So there is a huge division. This is one thing, but this was something that already existed before this current situation. So on the question if I have revised the framework of my book, Chip, honestly, my take on this is that it has become even more, in a modest way, I think it is in the right direction. So the question here is, the initiatives that I have identified that do work on reconciliation, the strongest ones, for example, Combatants for Peace, which is a joint movement of people from Israel and Palestine who have decided to move away from violence and get together. Those things are still strong and working, and they're getting stronger every day. But what I think is that the problem here is that the policymakers, for example, in the European Union level, they haven't identified those kind of things as relevant as they are. So they're still financing in like small drops of rain here and there, those very diverse initiatives, which could have been scaled up if they were seen as something that can be worked together as a network. So the idea that I have is that those things are still very much useful, and those people are getting together and trying to keep up with their work. But it's obviously very complicated in this context. So yeah, I think that the question of how to improve this still lies on how we define peace processes and what are the initiatives that should be happening at the same time. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
I think that the core problem that you covered is that the peace is this linguistic paradox where the peace process leads to more violence, and the US basically waits for it to happen. As you said, you can predict when it's going to happen, and people just forget about the reason behind all of this, which is Zionism. So I think what Palestine and Israel is, it's not a peace process, but a liberation process. Palestinians being liberated from the oppression and the occupation that they have been through for more than 76 years, and also the Israelis from Zionism. I mean, Zionism is literally based on the denial of people. When Professor Babel was here, he was talking about how the beginning of the century, Zionists created art to deny the existence of indigenous people in Palestine. So it's very fascinating, and I'm really glad to hear listening to you. How can European countries take responsibility for this and actually help in the liberation process? Because if we keep waiting for another conflict where people, one side, dehumanize another, is going to prolong human suffering, and children are going to still die. I mean, just yesterday, I thought video was tried with its sad blow, and I think one step.
Thank you, João. So yeah, first of all, yeah, this is very emotional, and I agree with you. We have talked in the past weeks on how much this has been painful to all of us. One of the things, João, that I would answer is that while there are historical facts that we can keep analyzing to the bone, there's something that must be done, and this might be a better answer also to what Chip has talked about when he raised the idea of the reconciliation commissions, because the reconciliation commissions are looking for the truth, and you know, it's like reviving the past in a sense that can be traumatic, and there are some studies on those reconciliation commissions that show that sometimes they can even bring about more resentments too. So one of the things that I would say is that looking into historical narratives doesn't mean continuing the cycle of blaming. You know, this is something that we need to pass forward, the question of blaming. I think that it's important that people take responsibility for what's been going on right now. And the question of the Zionist movement, for example, we can keep discussing if the Zionist movement was something good for history or not, but it is a fact, it is established. So if we don't move this, we are going to keep repeating narratives of blaming, of narratives of who began what, which are problematic, because those are not the types of narratives that bring us to the same place. That is, we don't want to continue this. So I think the question is not who began what, but how to move past this. And how the EU countries can take responsibility. Well, I think that European Union countries have taken, in a sense, a lot of responsibility for imperialism and everything, at least in discourse. And then there is a response that is reflected into budgeting, right? So the European Union being the biggest donor of Palestine, for example, but then this is not enough if it's not structured. So the way I think that the EU and policymakers should take responsibility is by trying to understand what's been going on and trying to enhance the types of projects that can really lead to people moving forward conflict. This is something that is important too. Like, we need to pass through what's been going on right now, and then we can try to revive the past and trauma of the past. But at this moment, it's more important to try to understand what is the shared future, what is the shared narrative. One of the things that Ilan Pape also said when he was here, and this is part of his overall work, is that there is no Israeli history and Palestinian history. There's the history of Israel and Palestine. They're combined, they're together. So this is something that that we should assume from the start, so we don't continue dehumanizing people, because it's easy for us to assume another discourse in which to be just, we start dehumanizing Jews now, and this wouldn't be a way to move forward this. So my answer would be the same of what Sandra said in the beginning of the day today, which is we need to to move forward and avoid the binary narratives and the polarizing narratives and the sides narratives, and try to see that there is a common goal for the future. And did I answer you?
Thank you so much.
So I see we have Professor Andre here. Hi, thank you for joining us. We're gonna go for a coffee break right now, and then we're gonna be back in. What?
It's him first.
Oh, it's him first. I'm sorry, so it's him first. So Andre, you have the floor. I'm probably
Okay.
gonna.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I am not in Coimbra, so I am using Zoom. I hope you can listen to me and see what I will present. I'm afraid we will change the topic pretty much. It would be very interesting to keep debating the Middle East. But of course, I'm not an expert, and that's not my... Okay, here I am. Okay, perfect. So, hello, nice to see you. Sorry. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm sorry I'm not in Coimbra, but I have the pleasure of participating via Zoom, and it's an amazing conference, and I'm sorry not to be there. So, first of all, as I was saying, we are not going to speak about the Middle East. That's not the topic now. We will speak about something much less interesting. As we say here, from science to policy, the role of law in bridging the divide between science and policy. So now we'll have an epistemic move, we'll reflect on the relation between science and policy, and what kind of collaboration we can have. And I will be make something very, very, let's say, very clear, very simple, and very simple, which is to present to you an institution of which I am the vice president, which is the National Council of Ethics for Life Sciences. And you can see here I am showing it, the National Council of Ethics for Life Sciences. And let's take a look to understand the history, because this is a way to bridge the connection between policy and science and the role of law. So Portugal was one of the first European countries to feel the need for a national bioethics committee. Sorry. Why in 1990s? In the 80s, we had the assisted reproduction technologies. So the birth of babies in vitro, the beginning of problems with reproduction. And reproductive technologies changed pretty much the point of view on the relation between ethics, law, and science. What is the problem? What is technically possible is ethically admissible. And in France, they created the first Conseil National d'Éthique, and then Portugal was one of the first to follow that path, a National Bioethics Council. But from the beginning, it is quite interesting to take a look. The name is National Council of Ethics for Life Sciences. During 20 years, it worked as an advisor of the government. In 2009, so we have a new law from 2009, it's the legal regime of the National Ethics Council for Life Sciences. And now it is no longer working near the government, but near the parliament, which is an interesting perspective. So we are a consultory body of the parliament. Here is the law translated into English, and I will just mention you some few topics. First of all, the composition. I will be very short. The composition. Who is part of we have 21 members. 6 members are elected by the parliament. That's my case. I was elected by the parliament. I was not nominated. I had to undergo an interview, and 5 other colleagues, including my president, Professor Patrão Neves, and another 4. And then we have corporations and other institutions, 10 people. And that is quite interesting because the Portuguese democracy, the Portuguese Republic, still gives a lot of power to some corporations. You see the Medical Association, the Nurses Association, Psychologists Association, biologists, the bar, lawyers, the pharmacists. Then we have the rectors of Portuguese universities, the Lisbon Academy of Science, the Forensic Institute, 10 persons, 10 people nominated by associations and institutions. As you can see from here, most of them come from the scientific or medical sectors. In fact, there are many doctors, many physicians. And that's why during so many years, when we used to speak about bioethics and the National Council of Ethics for Life Sciences, it was pretty much a problem of medical ethics. Hopefully, things are changing, and we now have a very important line in the field of One Health. I will speak about it later on. One Health is a new important bioethical topic that is animal health, environmental health, and human health. So the role of biologists, the role of veterinarians. We should have veterinarians as well in this council. Okay, and then the Council of Ministers also elects 5 or nominates 5 other people. Okay, our mandate is independent political mandates in the sense that it lasts 5 years. That means longer than normally a government or an assembly. And as you saw, 10 in 21 come from so-called civil society. We have no binding authority. Only the parliament, only government make legislation. And that is very good. So I pretty much appreciate representative democracy and the power of the parliament and the power of the government. Of course, these expert bodies are important, and the legislator should read our recommendations and should take it into consideration. But of course, the decision is a decision of the parliament. I will give you the example of assisted suicide and euthanasia. We have several opinions considering that it is unethical to decriminalize euthanasia and assisted suicide. I must confess, I always voted against those opinions. I was always a minority view, but the majority was always against this, let's say, transformation of the legislation. And even though the opinions were negative, the legislator approved the law on assisted suicide and euthanasia. And they are very correct to exercise their powers. Okay, who may ask for opinions? So we are not an open body. that civil society can come to us very easily. That's not the, mostly we use on demand, we work on demand of the parliament and the government, and sometimes also some public hospitals or some important entities, but not very, very much. By the way, this is a pro bono activity, so there are no salaries. We lose our time, we lose our, of course, so of course it's not like that. So as I said, there are 21 members. I am the vice president, and the president is a very well-known professor of bioethics. She is also the vice president of the European Group of Ethics. And then you have a sociologist, a pharmacist, another pharmacist, another lawyer, public health, a doctor, a biologist, a doctor, a nurse, a doctor, a psychologist, a doctor, a biologist, a doctor, and a doctor, and a lawyer. As you see, many, many wonderful lawyers, doctors. I love doctors, but as I said, and I have said it publicly, medical ethics has been over represented. What do? We work on opinions and recommendations on demand of the parliament and the government. For example, our latest opinions, here is an example, on sexual conversion therapies, okay? We have an executive summary translated into English. You can take a look, you can consult it. Okay, we also have problems concerning intimacy within the school context, the problem of bathrooms for women and men, or bathrooms which are neutral, which is an interesting debate. And it is true, we agree that there is the right to have indeed a bathroom for girls and a bathroom for boys, and obviously a bathroom that is neutral. But there's nothing wrong about having a division of genders. That's the main opinion. And then more technical problems of drug use, like off-label use. Of course, each topic could be a conference. What I want to show you is the procedure. The procedure is a procedure of expert opinions. And indeed, they collaborate in the legislation. In the last years, two main topics have been on the table: surrogacy and euthanasia. There are many, many documents about surrogacy and about euthanasia. Also, the problems of gender identity and the problems of mental health. As you see here, the right to have gender identity, and that we pretty much agree, and so on. Okay, let's move to another point. We also have position statements. For example, in July, there was a news about the synthetic embryo. Immediately, because we have biologists and ethicists, we made a position statement explaining that we should not speak about embryos. It was just an experiment, and so on. We also, in the period of COVID, we had a position statement about vaccination of children, convince some parents to accept vaccination of children. Of course, we can criticize it now. Myself, I vaccinated the first child, but not the second, because after a few months, we understood it was not so important anymore. And a general position statement about COVID-19, the ethical considerations. Moreover, we have publications, and they are all online, and you can download publications, and so on and so forth. As I told you, and I am finishing, we have, as I said, this mandate from Parliament and government and civil society to give opinions on legislation. But we also have two main fields of work during this mandate. One is artificial intelligence, and the other one is the One Health. As I said, One Health is a new concept. Our seminar was last Friday. It was very important. Most of the presentations were not lawyers, they were biologists, they were environmentalists, they were indeed philosophers, lawyers, of course. So to sum up, let's finish and make a conclusion. These instruments that we have in Portugal and in France and in many other countries around the world, and in Spain and in Denmark and in Sweden and so many other countries, are important as a bridge between the policy makers and the legislator, the parliament, the government, those who draft legislation, and the experts and the civil society. So these committees are really important. There is even at European Union level, every semester, there is a meeting of national ethics committees in the country that is as the presidency of the European Union. And one of the big conclusions that we can bring from those meetings are the following. First of all, some topics are similar from Portugal to Romania, from Greece to Finland. So the problems of artificial intelligence and law, the problems of One Health, the problems of reproductive technologies, the problems of the end of life. The other idea is the following. In some countries, they are creating a second committee. They keep a bioethics committee for biology and medicine, and they are creating a digital committee or computer sciences committee, artificial intelligence committee. That's the case of Sweden, and that's the case of France, which is quite interesting in the sense that you are separating bioethics from new technologies, digital new technologies, and ethics and law. Well, I don't have a definitive opinion about that. What I can say is the following. In a committee that is so pretty much dominated by doctors, by medical doctors, of course, it is not easy to do a very good job in the area of digital ethics. It is a committee without engineers. So my opinion is whether we create a second digital ethics committee or we should change the structure of the National Ethics Committee for Science and incorporate computer science experts, digital experts, and so on and so forth. But by the end, at the end, what is important to mention is that modern states do invest in these national committees. You don't have it in Brazil. It's well, maybe because of the structure of Brazil, but Brazilians can speak about it better. And you don't have it in the United States at the moment. Barack Obama created the following president finished it, and Biden still didn't recreate it. But this was my humble contribution to the topic you are debating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor André. Well, I apologize because I think that this was a bit, I thought we were going for a coffee break, and then I didn't even introduce Professor André Dias Pereira. He's a professor here at the Faculty of Law and a researcher at this research center. And thank you very much for being here with us and talking to us. So does anybody have any question? Steve?
Yeah, just a quick question. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I sat on a number of ethics committees,
And when you were talking about the division of the data sciences and the life sciences, I understood exactly what's going on there. Because when you sit on an ethics committee with people from other disciplines, it's infuriating. So how do you do this in the life sciences, which is so broad? You've got doctors and lawyers. If you ever dare to get an anthropologist on there, you'll never get out of that committee room. But how do you actually manage a process with so many different a priori assumptions about what ethics is and is not?
Well, thank you for your question. At the end of the day, when a topic comes, there are some rapporteurs. So there is a kind of a specialization. For example, on gender identity, the rapporteur was a pedopsychiatrician and a lawyer, myself, and all the others, they read, they commented, they made some remarks, but of course, you cannot be an expert on everything. In the field of One Health, which is environmental health, animal health, and bringing together all those sciences for a new health, so to say. So very important. We had two biologists. Of course, they leaded the speech and the discourse, and there's even a publication mostly done by our biologists. So at the end of the day, the question is very good. Is it really so important to have 21 people there deliberating? Well, at the end of the day, the rapporteurs are very, very important in the decision and in the paper that you write. But sometimes it's important to have plurality of views. For example, there is an opinion about the Mental Health Act, and the opinion was written by a psychiatrist and a lawyer, but it was not approved. Well, it was approved. It was approved, but in the end, there was a declaration written by me and two other colleagues, very critical of the opinion. As well as in the area of assisted suicide and euthanasia, there is normally some dissenting voices. So there is also a certain representation, a plurality of the Portuguese society, and that brings some high-level democratic debate. So it's a contribution. But of course, the experts in the area, they are very important, and normally they are chosen to write down the opinion, and that's it. But for example, when you go to a parliament, I mean, you have 230 or 400 members of parliament, and they are not experts, and they vote. They vote considering the opinions of experts and political opinions. So somehow these committees are a bridge between science to politics. And that's an interesting bridge with defects, but that's what it is.
Anyone else? Got a question? Okay, so just to wrap things up, Professor André, would you like to say anything else? Any concluding remarks on this?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Enjoy your coffee break.
Yeah, thank you very much for your thoughts on this. I think we're going to deepen this session after coffee break, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what was the idea of the program. So we had so far the approach of case studies into my presentation. And I remember now because why I thought we were going for a coffee break was because Professor André had to teach another class, I guess. So we decided to have this here before a coffee break, but the idea now is to try to make this more concrete too, and to discuss, okay, we have all of those ideas, case studies, and a lot of things that we have reanalyzed, and what are the actual ways in which we can bridge science and policy making, how can we communicate more effectively as scientists, and how can we also work in a way towards a normative approach, but not just that, also what are the constraints of policy and politics, which I hope Fernando is going to talk a little bit about. We've been discussing this for a long time together, so this is what we're going to have after coffee break. So Thank you again very much, Professor André, for being here with us and for your presentation. And see you all in, let's try to keep up with time. So 4:30, right? Thank you.
Tchau, obrigada.
So, we are back now, still with a little bit of delay. So I hope coffee break was nice and that you had nice discussions. And we are going to finish now with Dr. Fernando Borges. Fernando is a researcher here at the University of Coimbra Institute of Legal Research and a science manager. And he's going to talk about competence and skills to translate research into applied knowledge. Fernando, I'm going to share the screen and you can start after 15 minutes.
No? Okay. Yeah. So, thank you for being present. I'll try to keep you as vague as possible at the end of the day. I think I'll be quite brief in my communication. The idea here for the program at this time, combining with Professor André, who talked before me, was to start thinking about more practical things that we could do or think or propose regarding the bridge from science to policy. So what I will do now is to talk a little bit about the competence and skills that the researchers might have or might develop to bridge this gap. So the general context here is the COVID pandemic, how it showed that everyone, a possible path between a collaboration between science and policy, or the need to collaborate between science and policy, the response that was needed for vaccines or isolation, all the protocols that were needed showed that this real need and real application for the collaboration between science and policy. And after, I think, or during the pandemic, or after the idea of the pandemic going away, people start realizing that they could apply the same logic or the same protocol for other societal issues like climate change, energy crisis, artificial intelligence, and green transition. So how we can use this collaboration between science and policy. So also one of the aspects here in the context is that there's an incredible wealth of scientific knowledge available at the click of a mouse. I think online, all the publications, either open access or not open access, we have a lot of knowledge, but we also have a lot of misinformation. So there's a challenge here on how to filter or how to find and how to use the good knowledge between all the scientific knowledge that's available online. And later on, the context, it's there is an appeal from at the EU level on scientific advice and the need to bridge the gap between science and policy making. Not only at the European level, but also at national level. So each country in the EU, they have their own specificity, their own ecosystem, like Professor André was telling us before. The example here in Portugal, other countries have their own boards or committees or own structures that can be of use. So we need also to understand not only the big picture at the EU level or international level, but also the national ecosystem. And the idea here is that at the end of the day, we need to get the best available science to decision makers when they need it, and in a usable format. So that's a significant challenge. Like we were talking before, there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of content online, there's a lot of publications, but not necessarily in the right format or in the right useful format for policymakers. They don't necessarily talk the same language. So that's the idea here, and I think that's one of the main issues here today was identity. So we're talking about here professional identities, not necessarily national identities, but we have here science and politics coming from or are viewed as two worlds apart, two different people, two different groups that works and see the world in a different way. So we have on one hand the values for rigor and advance eliminating hypotheses for scientists, and the policy that can values the conciliations and advances via compromise. So it's a different way of looking at things. So I don't know if it's big enough, but okay. So science wants to understand the world, politicians wants to manage the world, scientists are more problem-oriented, politicians may be more service-oriented, and science can accept unsuccess and risk, while politicians may not tolerate error and risk. So this last point was one of the things that I think that was the most challenging topic regarding COVID-19, because how we tell people that the vaccine or the treatment may or may not work, because it's something that scientifically we accept that, but when we communicate that, it may cause some problems or panic, or how do I get sick if I was vaccinated? It's something that sometimes sometimes difficult to deal with. I think it's one of the challenges when we are communicating science, but that's one of the things that we should take a look at. So the continuous separation between science and politics is supported by this linear model of science to policy interface. Like, we do science and then we transform it into policy. While if we approach in a co-production model, then we can benefit from a true collaboration. If we, from the beginning, think or put in a methodological terms a collaborative process or model, then we have a truly collaborative knowledge production where both sides can have things to offer, instead of I am the scientist, I have the knowledge, I will give my knowledge when I finish my research project to policymakers. So this linear model of knowledge transfer, it also contributes to this continuous separation between science researchers and the policy. So the solution for this problem is to have this competence framework to identify the missing and cross-disciplinary and cross-policy skills, knowledge, and attitudes to empower policymakers and researchers to better address today's challenge. This solution was proposed by the JRC, or the Joint Research Center at the EU. So it's maybe a project, a part of the EU Commission that works in this interface between science and policy. We have maybe other institutions that might work in this interface, like think tanks, but the JRC from the EU has had this work over the past decades, but I think that after COVID-19 they reinforced this role, and they proposed two frameworks to bridge the science and policy gap. The first framework, innovative policy, is focused on policymakers. They are divided into several competence distributed across seven clusters. So it's but it's, like I mentioned, focused for policymakers. I will focus more this presentation on the researcher side. I think it's the one that interests me the most, and probably as well here as researchers. And the second framework is the science for policy. That was designed then for researchers advising policymakers and organizations working at the science policy interface. It has 27 competences across 5 clusters. And the 5 clusters are understanding policy, participating in policy making, communicate, engaging with citizens and stakeholders, and collaborate. So the framework assumes these organizations already possess the primary research skills. So researchers, they do have already the research skills. You don't need to improve the competence of research. That's assumed. And then the competence framework will focus on the supplementary competence needed to navigate in the policy world. So this here is the structure of the framework. You can see these star, maybe these 5 point stars. Each one is the main competence, and then they separate the main cluster. Then they separate into all the 37 to 27 competence. All the frameworks so include 4 proficient levels. You can be foundational, which will be the basic competence. You are operational, but you still need some guidance. You can be at an intermediate level where you are somewhat independent for normal tasks. You can be at an advanced level or an expert level at the end. So it's not very clear for reading, but this image here, it shows one of the competence, like B1, which will be the B cluster, and the first competence. It's a knowledge brokering, and what is expected for this competence, and also what's expected for each proficiency level. If you are in a foundational level, and so on. Not even me can read that. It's very good. So foundational level is aware of the functions and all the way around. So many of these competence for researchers, they overlap also with the policymakers' competence, which is understandable, because if we are talking about a collaborative framework and a collaborative model, notably the clusters communicate, engage with citizens and stakeholders, and collaborate. Of course, they overlap between the 2 frameworks. The competence portrayed here are different than the ones that you need to be a successful pure scientist. So we're talking about the competence to be a good researcher. Is not necessarily the same competence to be a good researchers that bridge research to science to policy. Somewhat, we are the JRC or the competence already expect that you have these competences to be a good researcher, but it's not the same. It's a complementary set of skills. The assumption behind the framework is that any researcher who would be in a role to advise policymaker from a specific perspective would already master the competence needed in the scientific field. So you already dominate, or you have read knowledge in one field, but you can maybe have some transversal or cross-sectional skills to other fields of research, but also not necessarily the most experienced researcher might be successful in this advice position. I think that we all agree, and we all might know someone that is a truly exceptional researcher, a very good scientist, but sometimes they cannot communicate their research, or they cannot we can give example, they cannot be a good teacher, but they are exceptional researchers, or they are exceptional researchers, but they cannot bridge their knowledge or transfer the knowledge to decision makers. So that's I think that's something that we should acknowledge, because to avoid some sort of stigma or hierarchy between researchers. So I think that's here the idea for the framework is that we have different skills, different knowledge, and different roles to play in the scientific ecosystem. Finally, the policymaking audience is not a scientific audience, so policymakers listen, read, and understand differently. Therefore, scientists need to adapt if they want to be successful advisors. So here the idea before that it's not the same to present an article for a scientific audience to the policymakers, and also on the researcher side, we should make the effort to adapt what we know and how we present it when we are talking to other types of audience. I think that works for different targets, but in this case specifically to policymakers. A scientist who is advising policymakers need to understand that their question and be able to give a short, at least relative to a scientific publication, compared to a scientific publication, but not oversimplify. So I think here's one of the biggest challenges for scientists, how we can make it short, but not simplistic, and not to take out the content, not to take out the scientific knowledge and the importance of it, but also keeping it short, remembering that policymakers, they have different timelines, different deadlines, different ways to address, and many things to address. So it's here one of the challenges in this competence framework. Also, the idea for the competence framework is to empower researchers and organizations to ensure that they provide the most useful and robust evidence, presented also in a timely manner for policymaking. Here again, one other challenge for the science area. We don't have the same time frame, so we take longer to do things, we take longer to produce things, but sometimes we are asked to do things faster. So here again, the challenges will be to not compromise quality over velocity, right? So we still have to provide good and robust evidence. Here, the focus is on the good evidence, but maybe we have to filter, right? So to understand what will be the most robust and most useful evidence in some cases, and not the others. The framework also includes, or the idea also includes the research synthesis skills. So the idea, I think, I don't remember who mentioned that, I think it was Bruce at the beginning of the day, the idea of distilling the best available evidence. Community managed to leverage the wisdom of crowd system thinking and cross-disciplinary integration and strong communication and citizen engagement skills. So we have here a lot of different skills that someone must manage. It's not necessarily for everyone, but it's something that will be important if we want to develop a real solid bridge between science to policy, to take that into consideration. The framework also requires political intelligence and listening skills to discern when to present key facts and interpret the science in political context. I think we gave a couple of examples that maybe are true or are very specific to this. I think Joanna's presentation before is one of these cases. I mean, the book was already written. If the conflict in Israel didn't not start, then the idea would be different, or the presentation would be different. So here we must also have this political intelligence to understand when we need to have some positions, or when we need to have others. So this is important to understand the context and the system, to know when to communicate. And finally, one of the ideas, like I already mentioned it a little bit before, so no one person is expected to master all the competence in the framework. Again, I think one of the things that at least I try to be attentive is we talk a lot about mental health and all the pressures that we put into ourselves as researchers and into others or PhD students. Some of you who are here. No one person is expected to master all these competence, so it's important to say that. So it's also a work to be collaboratively and to be sometimes to be done in group. Not everybody will do that. So I have some final remarks about this competence framework. The competence framework aimed then to bridge the gap between science and policy, fostering a mutually beneficial ecosystem that reinforces trust. I think this was also one of the issues that we talked, I think was Sandra's presentation, and I'm trying also already maybe to facilitate the next presentation also to build some of the bridges that we mentioned before, and it's the advantage of coming last to speak. So I think that the distrust on political systems or the distrust on science, the misinformation, the context that we have is something that we see very clearly. So also the idea to have this framework to provide evidence for policy making, it's something that maybe, and I discussed that with Joanna before, maybe it's EU neutrality view on or maybe technocratic to a way to say, because we know that even science has some bias, or even science has some views or some context that is done. But the idea here for this framework and the general idea, I think, for the EU is to increase trust in science. So it tries to erase some of the idea of bias or politicality, to enhance the idea of trust as a universal point of view. So policymaking, the idea here for this framework is also that policymaking needs science. The policymaking, it cannot be done just on the basis of either bias or political agenda or social needs. I think that the idea here, and I think that's very broad already, that's we need science to give basis to the policy making decisions. The framework is a reference point for professional development and career progression. So, like I mentioned, PhD students can see a path, or researchers can see a path as a career, or how we can develop skills in a career perspective. The two competence frameworks are employed to design training courses and curriculum. So they are all public and downloaded and adapted. I think the idea here for the JRC and the Commission is to spread the word, and even if faculties or other institutions want to reproduce the model and the framework, they are most welcome. So the idea here is to provide materials to future training courses. Advancements in policy making and science for policy necessitate that organizations implement systematic and creative strategies for capacity building, incorporating more hands-on learning experiences. And I would also add some, maybe we talked about in different ways today about the needs to have measurements on how to evaluate these systematic and creative strategies for capacity building. And on final remark is to facilitate this, the European Commission has created a self-reflection tool that's smart for policy. You can all find it online, which allows policymakers and researchers to reflect on their different competence and receive tips to improve each competence. How many times
You have passed a long time.
So
Not even totally anymore.
now,
No.
okay, so if I have the freedom to speak. It's it's a final slide. It's a more informal one. The first slides were, it seems more a press release from the GRC and the competence framework, which was not entirely my intention. But I think it was a good way to present some of the ideas and some of the questions that I might have, and we can maybe discuss them here. So just present some of the general questions that I have for myself, and maybe you have for yourselves, and maybe you can have answers that will help me in the future, because this is, as some of you know, I think Bruce will know it, because we did presented a project application for a twinning project that we hope to get funded and to implement regarding these skills. And the idea here for those questions, and for maybe for a debate and for a research agenda that maybe continue in the future, is the idea here for scientists, if we should be or should not be generalists or have an expert approach. So the competence tells us, and also the presentation before from Andrea also mentioned the idea that we have a committee, and then everybody, maybe it's a generalist or it's an expert, how we can deal with these skills, if we should have one approach or the other, which is better maybe for science for policy, maybe a generalist approach. But to advance science, you have to be more an expert, to have more an expert approach. So I think that when you're talking about science and science development and science skills, I think we have to have these in mind. Other questions about the methodology, and sometimes it connects to this generalist view, because many of the projects that I see, and some of the ones that you presented today, we use, for example, art to bridge science policy. We use medical ethics to bridge science policy. And my question here is, should we have a specific methodology to bridge science policy that can be transversal to all areas, or at least to social science areas, or I don't know. So should we talk about a specific methodology for science for policy? And within this idea, we also should talk about the skills that researchers should need. So communication, political intelligence, listening, distilling. So what are the necessary skills that we have, and what are and what we are doing to train the next generation of researchers, or the current generation researchers in PhD? Should we do that for PhD? So we'll also talk about a lot about how universities cannot incorporate all the PhD students into the career, or the tenure track career. So should we maybe train them to be science advisors, or what? Also the work that needs to be collaborative. So we should then not necessarily focus on competence skills for one researcher, but for a staff or a group to be done. And the sixth one is the idea to a top-down, something that comes from the EU. It's something that's advised by the EU, the framework, it's top-down. How we can then adapt to different areas. In my case, how we can adapt to the legal research units that we are based on. How we can we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to use the work that has been already done, but we also want to have some to respect specificities in our own area. And finally, how we can have the correct measurements, how we can use that to assess research impact, because I think that at the end of the day, all this discussion, we're talking about research impact, right? How our own work, it's not confined to our own articles, our own office, and how we can truly contribute to society, and how we can give back the years that we spend researching. So these are general questions, just ideas. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so Fernando, I let you speak for 30 minutes. Not really, and I'm gonna tell you why. I think that this is a very good wrap up, right? We've been talking about case studies and things that we could do. And then Fernando's bringing us some solutions and even some sort of a tutorial of what we can do. So my idea here, and this is why I didn't interrupt you, is that instead of opening for discussion right now, I would bring Bruce in for the final session. Because Bruce is going to propose an activity which is participatory, and then this discussion can be incorporated into this activity. What do you think?
Sure.
Can it be Fernando?
Yeah.
Unless someone has a very specific question directly to Fernando? Clara?
I've been in that job a couple of times, translating research, and it's a full-time job. I mean, I really appreciate the idea of building skills in young researchers, but you can't put it all. And it really depends on who's paying. So at the OECD, policymakers were paying, so we were speaking the language of policymakers. And I have to say, having moved from a researcher to a translation person at the OECD, an analyst in the same area, to write a report at the OECD, I rewrote every single word researchers wrote. Every single word was written to get the report to policymakers. So I appreciate the effort, and I know the European Union loves frameworks and loves frameworks, but I think it's a difficult job. And the work doesn't end there, right? I think it sometimes feels for me it never leaves the bubble. Like if it's not being used like in society, then like I think we should include more, like we should do things more practical and to break it down into hard facts and soft facts, and then we have some hard facts that you can teach, but other soft facts that maybe leadership professors would communicate better so that we will be more capable to, I don't know, economic.
Well, Simone, if I may jump in on this, I don't want to open a Pandora box because we need to move on, but just a quick note. I think we have no philosophers in the room. We do have, so we have someone that can account for the question of practicality versus morality. For example, when you're talking about conflicts, moral decisions are not necessarily practical, but they're necessary. So this is part of one of the points that Fernando has made, and this is something I can say as a researcher, that is, we shouldn't be writing for policy. We must write things that are they're applicable to policy, but not for policy, because if we start to write for policy, then we're not doing research. So just like Clara said right now,
We agree.
you know, Clara is a researcher saying, I rewrote researchers' words, you know.
I don't want researchers to stop writing research. I don't think
This is
that-
the separate.
I don't think that would help policy, but that's my take on it, and I have to go, I'm sorry. And I would welcome applications from all of you. Together with Joanna, whatever comes out of this workshop, I'm sure will be wonderful.
Yeah, Clara is open to discuss ERC, Horizon Europe collaborations. Clara, thank you. Bye. Okay, so if you don't mind, let's incorporate this discussion into our closing remarks. Can it be? What? So thank you very much, Fernando, for this and this very interesting and useful discussion. So Bruce, can you come over, please? Going back to our program, what we were supposed to be doing right now is to create an output document which catalogs the challenges and opportunities across the different case studies covered during the day. So the first thing is we have someone also helping us with this, which is Louise Baja over here. She's a PhD candidate, and she has spent the whole day wrapping up our discussion and writing a document, and I'm going to call her in the end of the day to give a few words, okay, just to close it all. And now I'm gonna pass the floor to Bruce so that we can have a little bit of a discussion before listening to Louise.
Wonderful. How's everybody's brains doing? Slowly, slowly, but just in this last wrap-up section, it would be nice to go back to maybe what we started with, which is what is the intersection between policy, science, and identity and culture? This is a kind of complex net of different ideas, right? I think one of the things that we can say, following all of the contributions that we've had, is that identity and culture causes, it's a root cause, or they both are a root cause of human problems, right? Across the whole gambit, from public health to human rights, to conflict itself, to economic inequalities, to all of the issues that we've seen come up today. But identity and culture, with the right perspectives and methods and tools, can also be part of the solution to the problems that they cause, right? Now, how do we reconcile these 2 points? Identity and culture cause massive human problems, but they can also be the solution. And I think one of the things we can say is that if we have good linkages between research and policy, and we have high resolution ways to understand how identities are causing problems, we can work to protect our societies, our communities against those kind of problems that identities cause. So that's one way of kind of wrapping this up, is to see those intersections between identity, research, and policy. But I think what's so interesting about today is the number of different sectors that we have covered. And it was, I don't think by design, but maybe it was, but to end up with Fernando's conclusions there about, how do we practically design our universities, our systems, the largest, the greatest opportunities that we have, both in terms of money from the EU and structures from these organizations which are supportive of these endeavors. How do we best create the structures that can allow us to efficiently and systematically address these problems? And those questions, Fernando, you ended up with a fundamental to making this more efficient and more possible. So I wonder, one way we could look at these this wrap-up session would be to remind ourselves of the urgency of some of the problems that we are facing. And we've had obviously topics that have come up, such as the conflict that we're seeing in Israel, Gaza. We've referenced a whole range of different public health and economic problems and conflicts and ethnic tensions. I wonder if we could perhaps reflect together and perhaps ask our speakers and our audience to think about what we have learned collectively from all of these perspectives. And maybe we can divide those thoughts into 3 categories. The first would be, what have we learned about how identity impacts public health, right? If I think you're open, you mentioned climate change, and I would encourage us to think of public health and climate change together, right? As is often the case in policymaking. So public health, and as Tassos reminded us, economic development, the way in which identities, Tassos and Sandra referenced, are expressive of our sense of power or our lack of power, right? Our status, and how they encapsulate our sense of having low status versus high status, right? And how this would impact our planning and our policies of economic development or public health. So what have we learned about public health and economic development? And perhaps I can ask our speakers to respond to that. Give us a minute of your thoughts, and we can open up a little bit more. The second category I'd like us to think about is conflict itself, right? Conflict both in terms of the ethnic, religious, cultural weaponization of identity that many of us have referenced. What have we learned about how identity sits at the heart of that, and what can be done about addressing those features and disruptions in the society in more methodologically, more systematically? And I think the last reflection can be a general reflection, perhaps keying off of what Fernando finished with. How can we better equip ourselves systematically as the EU, as the United States, as any large collective of individuals and communities or committees, structures, to better deal with this systematically? What systems do we need to put in place? What systems do we need to encourage to come together, and what we do in our universities to help accomplish this? That's a huge amount of stuff, but I thought I'd just throw those 3 concepts out there. So public health, economic development, conflict in the widest possible definition of it, and the last idea of the systematic ways in which we need to innovate our systems to make this much more efficient and more effective. So, any thoughts? Could I go around in order of presenters? Richard, I think I'm going to speak for him, would probably say that public health and culture, public health policy and identity and culture are intimately linked, right? And as his examples of indigenous knowledge demonstrated very clearly, without a deep and relative understanding of what indigenous communities are going through, we have no hope of successfully improving, working together with those communities if we're a state, for instance, improving upon those health outcomes unless we see the world from their point of view. So that was probably something that Richard would say. Following Richard, we had Sun.
It's a really big question. Can I pick to answer one of the questions?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Chip.
Since we didn't delve into climate detail,
That'd be great.
To elaborate on that. We actually did a course on this for OECD, so it was stunning, and we discovered during constructing the course that this was not a politicized issue. There was a lot of consensus back in the 70s that environment, everybody's concerned about it. We all live in it. The effects are like our health. And it also now affects conflict, because things like droughts or storms can be causes for instability, national security threats, and literally civil wars in places like Sudan and Syria. That's why, hard-nosed organizations like the Pentagon have been concerned about this for years. But the polarization is just incredible. It's staying among political parties, and then the verge over the years where it's radically different. There was a poll last week that compared the U.S. to a variety of nations around the world, and it ranged like 12% to 44% difference in most nations, like Australia and Latin America. The U.S. divergence in terms of political partiness is 63%. In terms of those who believe climate is real and human cause, versus the science indisputably said, this has been the subject of now decades of work here in the country. And those who believe that it is, God's will or strictly natural phenomena without any human cause. And so this is an example of where, and I was going to answer this for now, again, I don't think you have that to the same degree here in the US and the EU, but the way science itself has become so politicized, we're not even the outputs of science, but the basic facts in which you do science are being tested, and that limits the ability to have scientific method hypotheses, because you don't have the standardized scientific method procedures, and you don't have the outputs that you need to do to make policy and then debate them in democratic discourse and have governments, societies do something about it. That's why the EU, frankly, is ahead of the United States until we have this legislation. Last year, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest investment in climate. It's got issues, but it's actually quite an important, investment in addressing this climate change problem, which is so urgent, because fossil fuel emissions are continuing to go up despite the failed Kyoto Protocol, which actually tried to get hard elimination of emissions. And then the New Paris Convention in 2015, which had more voluntary arrangements and incentives, that hasn't worked either. I mean, we're still seeing tremendous increase in fossil fuel emissions. We're still seeing, the harms and increasing intensity. Everything from sea level rise, melting ice caps, increasing storm and droughts. Pakistan, 30 nations flooded. So many people died. China. So I think climate is a public health issue. It's not a future concern. It's happening now. And I'm wondering if when you're doing the work you're talking about in curriculums, in training, do you have the need, as we certainly do in the US, consider very carefully how you talk to people? Because maybe there's 20% of the political parties that you're trying to that are in this camp of conspiracy theory mini nations. So that would require a completely different communications approach, right? You basically hear their values, and you customize your communication to their perspective, and you try to look for common ground. Like you're talking about common ground and, families and brothers, we all have children's commonalities. And then in teaching and practicing, you have, this would be right for role playing and experiential learning and education. So.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we're going to move on, but that's interesting because it connects two of those questions together, right? The public health side and what do we do about it? And Fernando, maybe we can come back to you in just a second, but we'll just go around and I think Tassos, you were next, is that right? Yeah. Yeah.
So, because I'm a bit confused with Chief's answer, the question is about identity.
Yeah, just to sort of wrap up.
Who has an iPhone? So, okay. In China, 50% of people have iPhones. In India, less than 5%. Who thinks that the mobile iPhones like us, or the number of iPhones will go out from where it is now?
In India?
In India and in China.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So, and the reason a lot of times we look at the development of other countries, look at the eyes of our own self. We use our own identity in assessing things. And that's what shocked me when I started doing research. Because a lot of times, a big part of this country's identity is how they are smart buyers. They understand the value of money, they work very hard for the money. They have families who might not have income, and they don't view themselves as smart buyers buying an iPhone because they view when they look at an equivalent product, look at what's happening now by 860, you can get an amazing phone, probably better. So what I'm finding is when I'm doing my research is that I started doing this and I always looked at the development, even if I remember the short video, but how it went around. And I went around with the circle and showed you the development model on the top, so you think that the value will shift in that way. Actually, we shifted in that program through generations, and now they just took us generations, 1,000 years. And when I tried in India and Indonesia, for example, they don't give up their roots and their heritage that quickly. So they're moving to different identities from what they expect. And identity is core, coming up with the right switches for development. That is for those countries, as opposed to what we see through our own eyes.
Thank you very much. That's great. And I think after Tassos was Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Well, you asked what we learned. I think one of the things became just more clear to me is of the that are going to change rapidly, going after it, going to Shia and saying Sunni is your brother is going to fall short. Finding the intangible way of guiding them without them realizing that's where they're going is actually very important when people, particularly when people are already at that point killing each other. That seems to be very important. That we identify climate change as a tangible problem, healthcare is a tangible problem. If we let our technocrats go after it, that's what they go after. They will try and fix the tangible. And what we're saying is that the intangible actually shapes the reality of that. So we need to be looking at that intangible. That's what anthropologists have done very well for many decades. All that we imagine ourselves being in a community, we imagine ourselves being an individual, and that has an impact on the real world, the tangible world. So I think it was, you talked about the intangibility of it, and all of the talks, it seems to be, including the science talk, how do you translate that, is really about how do you understand all of the things that the technical people might dismiss as non-relevant. Your ideas of gender, how is that relevant to mitigating flood relief? Actually, what we're saying here is it is relevant. It may not be relevant the same way in every place, but it is relevant everywhere because our imagined selves shape everything else.
Very nice, very nice. So can we actually, given that Joanna's kindly reminded me that we're running out of time, let's put all of the three questions together, which is kind of what certainly Steve has done. So Sandra, coming back to you, answer any of the three, all of them, see any connections?
I don't know, I think it's, humans have always had a cooperation and conflict, right? Those two things have always coexisted. And the point that was made earlier about kind of everything with borders, but we have always needed boundaries, right? We've always had a need for that. So I think a lot of the times when we have these discussions, the kind of cynical response is to say, well, if we think about identity, aren't we just manipulating people the same way that they're being manipulated by other politicians or marketing companies or whatever? And my response would just be that it's really not. We're tapping into a human need that's not going anywhere. And I think when it comes to kind of this balance that you have managed as humans to maintain between cooperation and conflict, we're struggling with that. And I think part of that is the kind of negativity bias that we see in thinking, where we react more to negative comments than positive things. Even if something negative is followed by a positive thing, we stay on the negative. Media amplifies that, social media amplifies that, political communication amplifies that. Historical narration in post-conflict societies amplify that because we silence cooperation, we silence dissent, we silence stories of people who did things differently, and we homogenize identities over time. So I think this emphasis on the importance of kind of unpacking and the importance of challenging and questioning within our groups rather than between groups is an important point that I take from today. Yeah, I think, and the last point I would say in terms of what you were presenting, and we were talking about this a second ago, is that we're in information overload space, both policy and research. We produce, and our kind of core matrices are about how much we can produce new things, but never about the value of those things. So I think part of what we need to do as a community of researchers and policymakers is to pause. The way that I talked about slow thinking as individuals, we need to do that as communities as well. What have we already produced? Do we have 1,000 million different toolkits? Probably. 1,000 million frameworks? Probably. 1,000 million research papers? Absolutely. But what are we doing once that's out? We see that as the accomplishment, right? But it's not. That should be the starting point of assessing its accomplishment. And I think that's what we need to do more as communities. That comes to the values that we hold, how we, So I think there's a bigger question there about, what are we doing besides just producing more? And where do we step back to look at what that has done?
Can I make a comment about the I'm here this when we were doing the study in December, okay, the photographic study, this consumer was talking about overchoice, and he was explaining that seated in front of Netflix in the evening because there's so much choice, they just keep skipping and they don't watch anything in there. Behavioral finance call this overchoice, and when you have overchoice, when it does, it reinforces that or bias, because you will, if you know it with people, you give them one option on their attention, choose them move on, you give them 100 choices of attention, and will choose attention, they will just stick there. Their option is taken.
Interesting.
Can I ask
Yeah, sure.
this point that Mr. Smith, the center, and if you recall, a key insight in climate change theory, which is that we already have all the technology, and the drawdown project is probably the resource of that. A lot more wisdom of the alien people, tilling the soil properly, crop rotation, and soil is a carbon sink, for example. Whereas we've got, in Greece, and the Netscape is technology, utopian. No, and he's calling for all these new technologies that are unproven. They're the sense that you're solving the problem, but they're not likely to work. Yeah. Not likely to be successful. But we need to do what I'm saying was out there and the low hanging fruit that can solve the problem.
Join the dots up a bit more. Great, thank you. And Joanna, any thoughts? Well done.
Yeah.
Camera around.
No, I think many things have been said. So just quickly to wrap up, I guess that one of the things that we have learned is that while identities might sit on the heart of conflicts, they also sit on the heart of belonging, of engagement, of community, of people getting together. So the question here is not whether identities are good or bad. Just like Sandra has been saying, they are what they are. They are part of us. So we need to understand that policy tends to be made for people, but then it's made in a place. And because of this, it's made for certain type of people. And this is something that we must counteract. So I guess that the main lesson that I take from here on how to better equip ourselves and to deal with this systematically is to understand that we are multifaceted beings and we have several types of identities. But in the end of the day, even though we have our own forms of belonging, of being connected to each other, of getting together into specific groups, we are in the end of the day just human beings. And for this reason, most of our policies, they should be designed for people and not for specific types of people. And I think this would solve several problems. It seems easy, right?
Yeah.
Although it's not, but this is what I take from today.
Thank you so much. Fernando?
Well, what I think from today, part of Sandra was talking about the weird overload of work, overload of information. We have to be fast paced, we have to be fast answers, we have to explain the world in a tweet in 450 characters or less. We have to do videos of less than 1 minute to explain everything. And we need to have to get feedback, fast feedback and results and so on and so on. So I think that's the general context, but I think that from today and from the take from today is that we need to do it. I think we need to stop, we need to think, we need to explain better, we need to take time to explain, we need to take time to filter, we need to take time to take in things, and we need also to take time to implement things. It's not just like it's not just as we are mentioning, it's not enough just to publish the papers or the books. We need to follow up. We need to see it grow. It's not at the end. It's not just to publish because otherwise we will only have another PDF line and the takeaways that we need also to listen to the other, to have the events, to have general takeaway.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think, as Joanna said, Louise has kindly been keeping track of everything that we've been doing and has already shown me her amazing summary. But obviously, just whatever you think would be great to say at the end.
Oh, wait, but you didn't say it.
I'm going to say something right at the end just to close off and say thank you to everyone. But just, Louise, whatever you would like to share would be great.
So, in conclusion, the intricate intersect between science and politics is undeniable, especially when addressing the complex challenges and opportunities we face today. The imperative to ensure social justice, improve public health, and preserve human rights underlines the need for harmonious collaboration between these domains. To effectively bridge this gap, several guiding principles must be adopted. Firstly, we must recognize the importance of management in informed policymaking. Traditional health impact assessments often fail to capture the nuances of different contexts that shape individual and collective behaviors. Embracing a multidimensional perspective that investigates vulnerability, resilience, and local dynamics becomes imperative to address inequality comprehensively. Furthermore, it is essential to understand the conflict between market-oriented principle and public health ideals. While public health seeks to counterbalance market-oriented ethics, equitable burden sharing requires that we collectively assume the responsibilities and benefits of protections
with due consideration for the most vulnerable. Social justice remains a central principle emphasizing the intricate balance between individual rights and social obligations. Although hierarchies may persist, they should not prevent the pursuit of a well-ordered and just society. Technology, when management through conflict, can either exacerbate problems or open solutions. The responsible and ethical use of technology plays a key role in shaping our future. Incoming ethnocultural and linguistic diversity into policy aimed at national cohesion and conflict resolution requires a peaceful and responsible approach. Environmental limits, harmonious coexistence, and respectful dialogue are key components. To archive ethical ideals, we must offer options rather than seek to reprogram respecting individual agencies and trusts. Therefore, business of public health lies in promoting social justice, and policymakers must recognize the need for adaptive policies that take into account the various stressors and spirits in communities. In this effort, the political landscape plays a key role, mobilizing emotions and collective identities, promoting plural and inclusive identities in political discourse can contribute to being a part of democratic life. Engaging with diplomats, politicians, and leaders is key to incorporate identity factors into human rights, defense and privacy legislation and policy. International norms, moral duties, and legal responsibilities guide us in the quest to preserve human rights in the midst of technological progress and cultural diversity. To successfully address global challenges, it is imperative that science and policy align their efforts in pursuit of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Collaboration must extend to stakeholders from all sectors, including consumers from diverse socio-economic backgrounds. A society that respects religious diversity can serve values alike in integrating ethno-cultural diversity into national cohesion and conflict resolution policies. In this complex journey, the key to building a bridge between science and the policy involves making discoveries universally understandable, applying research effectively, and measuring the impact of intervention. By upholding these principles, we can navigate the dynamic interaction of science and politics, create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. And she put all that together as we were speaking today. I think that's an amazing summary.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would like to thank very much, Louise, for your work and for your help today.
And I think that document will come to build on this conversation that we've all been having, and we will distribute it to the network of people that have signed up your emails. Thank you for doing that.
Oh, and Bruce, just a final word. If anyone wants to be added to the email list that we have passed in the morning, I'm going to pass this again so that you can do it while Bruce analyzes. Okay.
Great. So that just leaves me to say thank you to all of our participants and the speakers for an enriching day. I think our brains are finally seizing up. But it's been a very, I think, enriching experience and very stimulating. Thank you to the Institute for Legal Research, to Fernando for all of your department support, and for Joanna for putting us all together, for all of us for coming from all of these different places, and for our audience. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce, and it's lovely to have you guys here. So that's it. Let's wait for other events and contacts from us. Whoever wants to be in touch, just please give us your name, email, and institution. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for today.
Thank you.